Hello and welcome back to the Electronic Intifada's live stream for Wednesday, June 26th. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleagues Ali Abunimah, Jon Elmer, Asa Winstanley, and Tamara Nassar. It's day 264 of Israel's genocide in Gaza. We're now streaming simultaneously on YouTube, Twitter, also known as X, Facebook, and Twitch. And just a reminder, Tamara has recorded a tutorial for turning on live captioning during this live stream, which you can find a link to in the description below. Coming up, we'll have a discussion with Laila Al-Arian about a new documentary she produced about Israel's genocide on Gaza. And Jon Elmer will cover all the latest news and videos from the resistance, focusing on the ongoing defense of Rafah. But first, some of the news of Israeli attacks on Gaza and the West Bank between June 20th and June 26th. Israeli airstrikes pounded areas across the Gaza Strip this week, from Rafah and Khan Yunis in the south to Maghazi refugee camp in the center to Gaza City in the north. Early this morning, Israel bombed a home in the northern town of Beit Lahia, killing at least 15, injuring dozens more, and burying people under the rubble. Photos and videos emerged of rescuers trying to reach survivors under enormous slabs of concrete. Israeli tanks shelled areas in Rafah overnight, as well as Nuseirat refugee camp in the central area, where at least 5 Palestinians were killed in an Israeli airstrike on a residential tower. On Tuesday, Israeli forces bombed the southern city of Khan Yunis and 2 separate United Nations schools that have been turned into shelters for displaced people in Gaza City. At least 5 Palestinians were killed in the bombing of the Asma school in the Al-Shati or Beach refugee camp, and 6 were killed in the Abdel Fattah Hamoud school in Gaza City. Other attacks killed people in the Shujaiya neighborhood of the city on Tuesday. Zahar Haniya, the sister of Hamas's Politburo leader Ismail Haniya, was amongst those killed in another bombing of Al-Shati camp early Tuesday morning, along with 9 other family members. In April, an Israeli airstrike in central Gaza killed Haniya's 3 sons and 4 grandchildren. He said at the time that approximately 60 of his relatives have been killed since Israel's genocide began in October. In a statement, Ismail Haniya said on Tuesday that any ceasefire proposal that does not guarantee an end to Israel's aggression in Gaza is, quote, not an agreement. He added, if the criminal enemy thinks targeting my family will change our position or that of the resistance, they are delusional. Also on Tuesday, the Israeli military bombed the Maghazi refugee camp, killing at least 5, according to Al Jazeera. Gaza's Civil Defense Corps stated on Tuesday that in a 48-hour period, quote, the Israeli occupation targeted 4 shelter centers and 11 inhabited homes, which led to the martyrdom of dozens of displaced citizens in these centers and residential homes and left hundreds injured. Last Friday, Israeli forces attacked and bombed tents of displaced people in the El Mawasi area in the sand dunes along the coast near Rafah. At least 25 Palestinians were killed and 50 wounded in the attack, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza. It was reported that an Israeli tank shell had hit a tent housing displaced families. The Associated Press released this video after the attack. I'll speak over the subtitles for accessibility. Hassan Najjar. We had a strike. My 2 sons left after they heard the women and children screaming. They went to save the women, and that's when the second missile struck, and my sons were martyred. They struck the same place twice. The same day, Israeli forces bombed a residential square in the center of Gaza City, and Israeli attacks continued over the weekend. On Saturday, Israeli forces bombed the Al-Tufah neighborhood and the Shati refugee camp in Gaza City. Al Jazeera's Hani Mahmoud reported from Gaza on Saturday.
The ambulance is full, but more wounded are coming. Dozens of Palestinians were injured by Israeli jets in Gaza North, killing dozens. The warplanes targeted 2 buildings in a shot at refugee camp. It is one of 8 historic camps established in Gaza after the creation of Israel in 1948, displaced hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. And now it's where many took shelter from Israeli attacks on neighboring Jabalia 8 months ago. For the young generation, it is no refuge.
Netanyahu is a murderous, coward criminal targeting innocent children. If he were brave enough, he would have come to fight our men on the battlefield.
The dust had not yet settled here, that it rose on the other side of Gaza City. Another Israeli striker trapped this man in concrete. He kept losing consciousness and needed to be rescued right away. Covered in dust, survivors recalled the moment Israeli forces attacked their densely populated neighborhood of 𝐓𝐴𝐻.
I was sewing some clothes. I work as a tailor, and suddenly the whole building collapsed on our heads. My wife and children were killed. My whole family is gone.
Israel says its fighter jets had struck 2 Hamas military sites in the area. Hamas says Israeli forces are targeting civilians. It is the most violent day in the Strip since Israeli troops killed 274 Palestinians while freeing 4 captives in Nusayra earlier this month.
We will stay in Gaza and we will die in Gaza.
Staying in Gaza, but forced to leave their destroyed homes. Many can't find safety when it is their refuge that turns to rubble. Hani Mahmoud, Al-Jazeera, Deir al-Balah, Gaza, Palestine.
That was Al Jazeera's Hani Mahmoud on Saturday. Gaza's civil defense stated that the attacks on areas in and around Gaza City continued into Sunday and Monday, with Israeli aircraft bombing residential homes. Israeli airstrikes have continued to attack and kill humanitarian aid workers and security staff in Gaza, specifically targeting people who are trying to mitigate the accelerating starvation and lack of water and medicine. On Monday, Israel killed at least 10 people, including civil guards tasked with securing and accompanying aid trucks in Khan Yunis. The group was waiting for the trucks coming in from the Kerem Abu Salem or Kerem Shalom crossing. This is on top of last week's Israeli attack on people awaiting aid in Rafah, which killed 9 people, including civil security guards. On Sunday, the Israeli military bombed the headquarters of UNRWA, the United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees, which has been operating as an aid distribution center. Hundreds of people displaced by the Israeli military's ground invasion of Gaza were sheltering inside the facility at the time of the incident, according to Al Jazeera. At least 8 people were killed. On Friday, Israeli airstrikes targeted workers with the Gaza municipality, killing 5 of their engineering staff who were working on installing and repairing water wells. In a press release, the Gaza municipality said that these workers, who ranged in ages from 24 to 54, were performing their national duty and serving citizens despite extremely limited resources and high risks. They were working to pump water, the municipality said. Out of the 273 aid workers killed in Gaza since October 7th, more than 190 were working with the United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees. Israel is also continuing to directly target medical facilities and physicians. Gaza's director of ambulance and emergency services, Hani Al-Jafawi, was killed in an Israeli airstrike on the Al-Daraj clinic in Gaza City early Monday morning. The Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza, in honoring their martyr, stated that along with his fellow paramedics, he represented, quote, a solid model of steadfastness, determination, and sacrifice as they performed their humanitarian duty in evacuating the wounded and martyrs around the clock despite the bombing. The Israeli threat ignores all international conventions and treaties. The health ministry added that approximately 500 of its health personnel have been killed and more than 300 have been abducted and arrested over the last 8 months. Reuters published these photos of the aftermath of the Israeli attack on the Daraj clinic. 𝐄𝐥�ခြ𝐿, the director of the emergency department at Al-Aqsa hospital in Deir al-Balah, told Al Jazeera that by killing al-Jafawi, Israel killed a pillar of the health system in Gaza. 𝐓𝐡𝐞 said, quote, "It is clear that the Israeli forces are trying once again to destroy the health and medical system in Gaza completely." Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, stated on Tuesday that one of their colleagues, Fadi al-Wadia, was killed while riding his bicycle to work in Gaza City yesterday. Quote, "Fadi was a 33-year-old physiotherapist and father of 3. He joined MSF in 2018. Our thoughts are with his family and loved ones. Fadi's loss marks the 6th killing of an MSF staff member in Gaza since October 7th. We are continuing to verify the details of this horrific incident." The medical aid organization said on Friday that they have been waiting for 6 trucks filled with 37 tons of supplies, the vast majority of which are essential medical items that have been waiting since June 14th on the Egyptian side of the Kerem Shalom crossing point, unable to cross into Gaza where they are needed to save lives. Guillaume Thomas, Doctors Without Borders medical coordinator in Palestine, said that, quote, "These trucks are lined up, stuck, with about another 1,200 trucks waiting to enter the strip. This is incomprehensible and unacceptable. It's like asking a fireman to watch a house filled with people burn down and preventing him from putting out the fire." Various international agencies have reported this week that Israel's engineered starvation of Gaza, using hunger as a weapon of war, is accelerating. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, the IPC, says that, quote, "The situation in Gaza remains catastrophic and there is a high and sustained risk of famine across the whole Gaza Strip." The Multinational Hunger Crisis Experts Group estimates that 20% of all Palestinians in Gaza go entire days without any food at all, and that 96% of all Gaza residents, approximately 2 million people, face a high level of acute food insecurity. The IPC added that there was a brief improvement to food security levels in March and April, but those gains are being reversed as Israel continues to close essential crossings into Gaza and make it extremely difficult to obtain fresh produce and dairy. The United Nations Nutrition Cluster reported that access limitations and security concerns, quote, "have significantly limited pipeline supplies for the blanket supplementary feeding program, which can only cover 30% of the needs of children and pregnant and breastfeeding women through the end of July." Meanwhile, the Islamic Relief Charity stated on Tuesday that, quote, "This hunger crisis is entirely man-made, caused by Israel's ongoing attacks and blockade. Virtually all of Gaza's own food production has been wiped out and nowhere near enough humanitarian aid is being allowed in, as Israel continues to restrict entry of supplies into Gaza and movement of aid convoys within Gaza." The charity added that it is urging governments, quote, "not to wait for an official famine declaration before taking stronger action. Aid agencies have been warning of famine for months, but official famine declarations are extremely rare and usually come only when it is too late. We do not need a famine announcement to know that Palestinians, especially young children, are starving and cannot access sufficient aid." Islamic Relief noted that the U.S.-led initiatives like the expensive temporary pier that is constantly needing repairs, as well as airdrops, quote, "have been costly distractions while people starve. The only way to ensure people can access sufficient food is through a ceasefire and full unimpeded humanitarian access. International governments must use all the leverage and pressure they can to ensure that happens immediately. There is no time left to act." The Geneva-based Euromed Human Rights Monitor stated, quote, "A total of 49 child deaths in the Gaza Strip have been attributed to hunger and food insecurity. and an additional 3,500 children are at risk of death from malnutrition, inadequate vaccinations, and deficiency in nutritional supplements. They are currently suffering greatly from thin bodies, unusually pale faces, and dull eyes due to the widespread phenomenon of emaciation, acute weakness, and epidemics. There are an estimated 21,000 missing children in Gaza. According to the charity Save the Children, up to 21,000 children are, quote, missing in the chaos of the war in Gaza, many trapped beneath rubble, detained, buried in unmarked graves, or lost from their families. The agency's child protection teams reported this week that the latest displacements caused by Israel's invasion and attacks on Rafah have separated more children and further increased the strain on families and communities caring for them. Save the Children says that at least 17,000 children are believed to be unaccompanied and separated, and approximately 4,000 children are likely missing under the rubble, with an unknown number also in mass graves. Others have been forcibly disappeared, including an unknown number detained and forcibly transferred out of Gaza, their whereabouts unknown to their families amidst reports of ill treatment and torture. Al Jazeera produced this report on Monday on the missing and disappeared children of Gaza.
The United Nations has called it a war on children. Gaza's health ministry has documented more than 15,000 of their deaths. And aid agencies are sounding the alarm on yet another grim statistic: the missing children. According to humanitarian organization Save the Children, almost 21,000 minors in Gaza have been reported missing since the beginning of the war in October. 17,000 of them are either unaccompanied or separated from their families, while at least 4,000 are believed to be trapped under rubble in the aftermath of Israeli strikes on residential buildings and refuge centers. Wherever you look in Gaza, there are children. They make up nearly half of the population in the besieged strip. In the wake of unrelenting war, aid agencies say it's become more difficult to support them. Nearly 19,000 children are reported orphaned in Gaza. That has left the fate of many minors entirely or in part in the hands of total strangers. They warn this is increasing the risk of abuse, exploitation, and neglect. And that's put a spotlight on a generation of children who have not only lost their parents, but are left alone and unprotected in a war zone. Felix Nyawara, Al Jazeera.
That was Al Jazeera's Felix Nyawara. A Gaza-based child protection specialist with Save the Children stated, quote, every day we find more unaccompanied children, and every day it is harder to support them. We work through partners to identify separated and unaccompanied children and trace their families, but there are no safe facilities for them. There is no safe place in Gaza. Besides, reuniting them with family members is difficult when ongoing hostilities restrict our access to communities and constantly force families to move. The Save the Children staff member added, neighbors and extended family members who have taken in lone children are struggling to meet their basic needs, such as shelter, food, and water. Many are with strangers or completely alone, increasing the risk of violence, abuse, exploitation, and neglect. Turning to the occupied West Bank, Israeli forces carried out a series of invasions and arrest raids in Bethlehem, Ramallah, and Qalqilia governorates on Tuesday. The news agency Wafa reported that at least 25 Palestinians were detained. Defense for Children International Palestine stated on Tuesday that a 12-year-old boy, Mohammed Hoshie, died this week after Israeli soldiers shot him in the abdomen on June 14th during an invasion in Ramallah. According to the rights group, Mohammed was on his way home after finishing football training and was shot by an Israeli soldier from inside a heavily armored military vehicle from a distance of between 70 to 90 meters away. Ayad Abu Ektesh, Accountability Program Director at Defense for Children International Palestine, said, quote, Palestinian children live in a hyper-militarized context where Israeli military incursions into Palestinian communities to arrest and intimidate Palestinian civilians is the norm. During these incursions, Israeli forces routinely resort to intentional lethal force in situations not justified under international law and make no effort to impartially investigate or ensure that Israeli soldiers act in accordance with international standards. Instead, all Palestinians, including children, are considered targets. Israeli forces and settlers have killed 54 Palestinian children in the occupied West Bank just in 2024, including 2 United States citizens, according to documentation collected by Defense for Children International Palestine. 135 Palestinian children have been killed in the occupied West Bank since October 7th. On Saturday, photos and videos circulated on social media showing a young man in Jenin who was strapped to the metal hood of an Israeli army jeep and used as a human shield by Israeli soldiers during an invasion into the city. Mujahid Abadi, who is 24 years old, said that he had stepped outside his uncle's house in Jenin during the Israeli raid and was shot in the arm and the leg. He said he took shelter behind a nearby vehicle. Abadi told Al Jazeera reporters that after nearly 2 hours of hiding while his wounds were bleeding, Israeli troops forced him out of his hideout and started punching and kicking him, including at his bullet wounds and his already broken bones, while laughing and joking. Here's a video of Abadi talking about being used as a human shield by Israeli soldiers.
On the third attempt, they shoved me over the hood. It was extremely hot that my back was burnt. They drove me back and forth for 20 minutes. As we started to go back home, the Israeli soldiers opened fire on us. My cousins were injured, and I also received a bullet in my arm. I fell behind an Israeli armored vehicle parked outside my uncle's house. The Israeli soldiers kept firing, and by the time I fell to the ground, I received another bullet in my leg. Some of our friends and neighbors were also injured. I remained on the ground bleeding for more than 2 hours. None of the soldiers approached me, only one drone hovering above me. I kept bleeding. After that, another Israeli armored vehicle approached the one I was lying behind. They tried to run me over. There's a lot of footage proving all this. I crawled with difficulty and came clear within their range. As they approached, one of the soldiers trampled my head under his boot, kept punching me in the face, kicking my bleeding leg. He twisted my injured arm. My leg and arm bones were broken, totally crushed. The Israeli soldiers kept laughing and mocking while beating me to death. 2 Israeli soldiers grabbed my hands and 2 others my feet, then started swinging me left to right. I fell to the ground twice, and on the third attempt, they shoved me over the hood. It was extremely hot that my back was burnt. They drove me back and forth for 20 minutes. I had hoped to be dead before the Israeli soldiers arrived. I had expected them to attend to my wounds, not to beat and batter me, while I already had 2 critical injuries. The Israeli soldiers kept me on the armored vehicle's hood for 20 minutes, driving back and forth.
That was Mujahid Abadi in Jenin. U.S. State Department spokesperson Matt Miller said that the incident was, quote, unacceptable and called on the Israeli military to investigate itself. Finally, we wanted to bring you some images and videos from journalists and others in Gaza who are not just relentlessly documenting the unspeakable atrocities, but also making sure to highlight the resilience, joy, and determination of the Palestinian people. Journalist Hossam Shabat, who reports from the north of Gaza, met a young aspiring journalist who had thought that he had been killed. Here's that conversation, and they speak too fast for me to narrate the captions at the same time, but she is saying that she thought he was martyred when the Israeli army invaded the north. She says, "We were about to mourn you, man. I swear we missed you. I swear to God I came down to see you." Hossam says, "You're a real champ. What do you want to be when you grow up?" And she answers, "A journalist." And I was thinking, how am I supposed to be a journalist now if Hossam Shabat was martyred? And she says, "May God keep you safe." He says, we'll make you into a journalist. And she says, inshallah, God willing. Let's play that.
قالوا عنك استشهدت. شو ليش؟ ما فات الجودة على الشمال. كنا نعيط عليك يا والله. لهالدرجة؟ بتنام بايش؟ لا اله الا الله. والله نزل علي. قسما بالله العلي العظيم نزل علي. اشتقتي لنا يعني؟ والله اشتقتي لنا. جدع. ايش بدك تصيري لما تكبري؟ صحفية. بقول كيف بدي اصير صحفية واسم شمالتها يستشهد. كيف بدي اصير صحفية؟ لا ليش نستشهد؟ لا يبعد الشر عنك. كيف بدي اصير صحفية سعيدة؟ لا بنسويك صحفية. بدك صحفية تصيري؟ ان شاء الله. بتصير صحفية. يلا سلام. يلا سلام.
Palestinians are rebuilding Al-Shifa Hospital, the Gaza Strip's largest medical facility that was destroyed by Israel and turned into sites of executions, abductions, and mass graves. Workers with the Palestine Red Crescent Society also released a video of themselves cleaning and repairing a clinic in Jabalia that was decimated by Israeli forces following a raid at the end of last year. They say they are preparing to reactivate their medical services there. And journalist Bisan Auda posted this video of Palestinians flying 150 kites over the skies of Khan Yunis last weekend.
I'm living my dreams, okay? I'm living my dreams. 150 kites carrying the Palestinian flag are over the camps here in Khan Yunis. So the sky is already liberated. See this with me. I'm so happy, okay? This is one of my dreams, to see kites carrying the Palestinian flag, and everyone is flying the kites. I mean it, everyone.
It's good to hear her laugh. That's it for the news roundup. As always, go to electronicintifada.net for much more, especially to read our new features by our phenomenal and brave writers in Gaza. You're watching the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleague Ali Abunimah. Hi, Ali. Oh, you're muted.
Hi, Nora. How are you? Thank you for, as always, that very comprehensive report. And just seeing that girl interacting with Hussam Shubat was so moving.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder to me of how respected journalists are in Gaza, because the Palestinian journalists are the only ones on the ground covering what's going on. They are from the community, and they are paying an extremely high price, more than 140 murdered so far. So it's just a reminder to really, everything we know about what's happening is pretty much thanks to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been another very brutal week, but there has been a lot of resistance. And coming up, we'll get a full update from Jon Elmer, who will cover all the latest news and videos from the resistance on the ground, focusing on the ongoing defense of Rafah. But first, we wanted to welcome Laila Al-Arian to the program. An Emmy and Peabody award-winning journalist, Laila is the executive producer of Fault Lines, Al Jazeera's flagship investigative documentary series. She co-authored with Chris Hedges the book Collateral Damage, America's War Against Iraqi Civilians. And back in 2011, she produced Al Jazeera's groundbreaking work on the Palestine Papers, the largest ever leak of Palestinian Authority secret documents, which detailed their close collaboration with the Israeli occupation. Today, we'll be talking about The Night Won't End, the latest episode of Fault Lines, which is about Israel's genocidal war against the people of Gaza. Our colleague Asa wrote an article about The Night Won't End, which people can go to electronicintifada.net to read. It also includes the full video of the film, which is free to watch on YouTube. Laila, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Hi, Laila.
It's good to see you. And I think for anyone who watches The Night Won't End, will find it's not an easy watch. Myself, there were several times where I had to pause it and stand outside for a few minutes to collect myself. It takes us through the true scale of the destruction and the unprecedented extent of Israel's genocide in Gaza over the last 8 months. Can you talk about the premise of the documentary and how you identified the 3 families that are the focus of it?
Sure. Well, I should mention that by the time, Israel launched its onslaught on Gaza back in October, my program, Fault Lines, is a documentary program focused on the U.S. and its role in the world and based in D.C. By the time everything was happening in Gaza, I had already, commissioned everything for the fall season. So we have 2 seasons, fall and spring. So I just felt like I was kind of helplessly watching as a journalist, everything happening. I have family in Gaza. My mom actually found out in April, so the number could be higher now, that she lost over 200 members of her extended family in Gaza. They come from a big family. And I really wanted to cover it as a journalist. But of course, Israel has also barred journalists from entering Gaza. So that burden and responsibility of covering everything in Gaza has fallen solely on the shoulders of the journalists, the very brave journalists and resilient journalists in Gaza, who you've mentioned have been killed in horrifically record numbers. So we knew that for the spring season that we wanted to do something, ambitious, just given the scale of the destruction, the devastation, the suffering. And of course, you always, think about, like, where do I even begin? Every single day, there's a new horror. Nora, it took you 20 minutes just to go through. I'm sure it wasn't even everything,
Right,
just in the last few days. And it's one horror after another. So, obviously this was months of this, and it's been ongoing months of this. So what my colleague 𝐄𝐿 𝐄𝐿 and also Sharif Abdul Quddus, a journalist who's the reporter in the story, all worked on this together. And what we did was start to kind of identify some major cases. And we looked at, of course, airstrikes were the way that most civilians were being killed in Gaza. So it was very clear that we would have to cover an airstrike. And we looked at one that happened in December, on December 11th. And it took place in Gaza City. And the Salim family was sheltering. The family that we focus on had already been displaced from their home. It's unfathomable to think every single Palestinian family has been displaced at this point, and not just displaced once or twice, multiple times, time and again. And in fact, some of the families that we interview in the film have already been displaced since we interviewed them. So the Salim family survived. The family that we interview in the film survived an airstrike that killed more than 100 members of their family, of their extended family. And the daughters of that family were injured, some of them, in this attack. And the family then gets displaced yet again. And Hiba Salim, who's the matriarch of the family that we talked to, ends up taking her family to shelter with her brother in Sheikh Radwan in Gaza, in an apartment building there. And then this just blew my mind, but this is something that you see over and over and over again in Gaza, which is you survive one horrific massacre, one horrific incident, only to find that you're killed in another horrific incident. So really, there's no safe place in Gaza. There's no place to shelter, and there's no escaping Israeli attacks, whether they're from the air, whether they're artillery attacks, quadcopters, snipers, or executions by ground troops, which is what ended up happening to the Salim family yet again when Israeli ground troops came into their home and executed at least 11 men, including Hiba's husband, Ayman. So we focused on an airstrike, on an execution, on so-called safe zones. So this is something that the U.S. likes to talk a lot about, which is, well, the Israelis gave Palestinians safe zones where they can go. And of course, what we show is that it's a myth. So many families who were told to flee to the south where it's so, quote unquote, safe, fled to the south only to find that their loved ones were killed. Their loved ones were killed anyway. And we tell the story of Abdullah Al-Ghaf, which is why we wanted to focus on the safe zones, who is a father of 4 children. His youngest son, 2-year-old Firas, asked him for some biscuits one morning. The children were hungry because just like in the north, in the south, food was not available. And he went to the market to find biscuits for his son. And after he left, his family was killed. We think it was an artillery attack, although We've also received reports that it could have been an airstrike as well. It's possible it was both. They were sheltering in an apartment building across from Al-Amal clinic in Khan Yunis, and his son Firas was killed, and as well as his wife Mariham. And you see, the way we found out about this story is through a viral video in which Abdullah kisses his son as he's in his shroud after he was killed, and gives him the biscuits and says, I brought these for you. Here you go. It's just an absolutely heartbreaking moment. But our idea for the film was to kind of go beyond the cell phone videos, which we see every single day on social media, and to really try to take a step back and put the viewer in with these families so that they can really get a sense of what these families have experienced in their lives. And we also look at the case of, and there's a reason this is an hour and 20 minutes, which is one of the longest fault lines we've ever made. But we also look at the case, which is the most well-known out of all the cases. We look out of Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old girl who, her mom also fled to the south on orders by the Israelis, quickly found out that the south wasn't safe. And it was something her mother told her that made her want to go back north where she's from, which is, Wissam, her name is Wissam. Her mom told her, Wissam, write your name on your arms in case you're killed and people can identify you. And this is something we've heard over and over again, including parents writing their children's names on their arms and legs. And she said, I wanted to go back to the north so that if I die, people will be able to identify me. And we kind of go through that whole horrific case and work with the UK nonprofit research organization, Forensic Architecture, to kind of forensically deconstruct what happened to Hind and her family.
And can you explain the process of how this film was made without being able to go to Gaza yourselves due to Israel's ban on journalists and the complete sealing off of any border crossings?
Yeah, so we worked with a Palestinian, very talented media company called Mediatown, which has been working in film and video production for many years, very professional. And they have a number of cinematographers and journalists on the ground in Gaza that we worked with who filmed with the families. And as we were doing our own reporting, because some of these stories are very detailed, and we needed to kind of make sure that we were collecting as much evidence as we could to back up our reporting. We also hired some local journalists that we found through social media. And I just want to say something about these journalists. They worked under the most extraordinarily difficult circumstances imaginable. Everything that people of Gaza are going through, they're going through, especially the journalists in the north we were working with. They were so hungry, so tired. I remember one of them told me at one point, he said that they shared one can of food, one can of beans among 10 men one night. So they're working really hard. They're carrying their gear and their cameras, and malnourished, unable to eat or source food. They themselves are losing family members on a daily basis. Sometimes I felt like, everybody I was reaching out to had just lost someone or was dealing with some kind of crisis or another, and yet they were so responsive and professional and did the work. And just to give you a couple of examples, one of the cameramen, I was writing him and he said, I'm so sorry I haven't been responding to you, but I'm in so much pain on my leg because of an accident that I had before October. So of course, we know about the people who've been injured and unable to receive medical care, since October, but then there's people who've had injuries or illnesses or whatever it is who can't get any medical care since then. And then we had, I reached out to a journalist who was one of the people on the scene after Hind Rajab, her body was discovered, as well as that of the 2 paramedics. And he had filmed a US-made shell that was found by the ambulance. And I just wanted to ask him about filming that and all of that. And I was told, by the way, this is Mu'tasim al-Dallul. I was told, by the way, he just lost his wife and son, just a few days ago. So he was still freshly grieving and mourning his family, trying to stay alive. And he writes me and says, I'm so sorry for my late reply, but he was covering a flower massacre as I was writing him. So it was like, this is the kind of just unrelenting challenges and grief, and it's just unspeakable what they're going through. And yet they did such a beautiful job with this film, working with us.
Laila, the film is extraordinary. I agree with Nora. It was very difficult to watch, but necessary to watch. And the reason that it was so difficult to watch is because, it only struck me when watching it in comparison to so much other media I've had to see, that this film puts Palestinians at the center. You'd think that that's where they would be anyway, given that they're the victims of a Holocaust, the victims of a genocide. But it was extraordinary to see Palestinians telling what happened to them. And you did such an extraordinary job corroborating, I would say even over-corroborating their stories. The level of evidence in this film is extraordinary. And as you know, Laila, I look at a lot of the Israeli propaganda, the mass rapes films, and so on. So we pay close attention to the evidence, and it's all there. And as you mentioned, you look closely at the story of Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old girl who was killed as she was desperately pleading on the phone to the Palestinian Red Crescent Society to come and rescue her. And the videos of her last words were widely viewed online. And, her killing really struck people. She's one of maybe 15, 20,000 children. The report says another 21,000 children are missing. So she's only one, but it touched people's hearts because, the sound of her own voice pleading for help reverberated around the world. We're not going to play that right now, but just to demonstrate how this film gives Palestinians really the chance to narrate what's happening to them. Let's take a look at this clip of Hind's mother, Wissam Hamada, speaking about what happened. I think it's extraordinary.
With airstrikes in the south, some families who had fled the north went back there, trying to find some form of safety, like Wissam Hamada. After fleeing to the south on orders from the Israeli military, she and her husband were separated.
أبويا وزوجي كانوا بسيارة تانية ما قدروش يصلوا للمكان اللي إحنا وصلنا له من شدة القصف. فمن الخوف صارت أمي تحكي لنا اكتبوا يما أسماءكم على إيدكم لو استشهدتوا يعرفوا أنتوا مين. أنا حكيت لها في هذا اللحظة من حد ما حكيت لأمي هذا الإشي، حكيت لها أنا يا أمي بدي أخذ أولادي وأرجع على غزة عشان لما أستشهد يعرفوا إني أنا وسام حمادة.
She came back to the north with her 2 children, Iyad and her 6-year-old daughter, Hind. They stayed with relatives, including Hind's 15-year-old cousin, Layan.
كانت تحكي لها لا أنا بدي أطلع جراحة، أنا بدي أحكم أكتر منك يا هنود. بتقولها طب أنت كوني طبيبة جراحة وأنا طبيبة أسنان ونفتح عيادة مع بعض.
But in the north, safety was impossible to find. Late on January 28th, there were heavy attacks by Israeli forces in Gaza City, near where Wissam and her children were staying with relatives.
أمامنا أحزمة نارية بشكل مرعب جدا لدرجة النار تخش على البيت اللي إحنا فيه. حاولنا نتوسط المنزل وبطلع في هنود بحكي لها يا هنود تعالي نامي عندي. هي مغمضة عينيها وأنا أطلع فيها وأقول يا الله يا أمي ما أحلاكي معقول بدك تسيبيني يا هنود.
The next day, the family decided to leave once again in search of safety. It was cold and raining hard. Wissam's uncle Bashar left with his wife and children, including Layan. Hind went too.
حكى أنا بدي أخذ أولادي وولاد بنت أخويا أحطهم في السيارة ونتوجه لمنطقة أبعد من المنطقة فيها وبدي أرجع أخذكم. فحطينا أولادي في السيارة يد نط من السيارة بدوش يروح.
But soon after they left, Wissam says the car was fired on by Israeli forces.
Now, in this film, as I mentioned, you have the testimony from Palestinians, from Hind's family, but also the other families whose personal testimony is no less compelling. But you also do something else in the case of Hind Rajab. You feature forensic architecture, which is a research group that uses really sophisticated forensic techniques, and earshot, which uses sound analysis. And they show how they do their analysis in the film. And basically, what they are able to show, they're able to determine that an Israeli tank nearby fired hundreds of rounds into the car where Hind was, and her cousin Layan, who'd already been killed at that point. Hind was the last person alive. And you do this investigation, which is very compelling, but for some reason, the United States government, with all its resources, is unable to do the same thing. And State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller actually defends Israel's bogus version of events, despite all the evidence. I think we can actually take a look at Matthew Miller speaking. And I'm sorry to subject you to this, Laila, but you've probably seen worse. Let's take a look at Matthew Miller, the State Department spokesperson, reacting to the murder of Hind Rajab at a time when it was causing global outrage. Do we have that?
Maybe we don't have that.
Okay, maybe we don't have that. We can come back to it. But
well, I want to say something about this.
Yeah.
So Matthew Miller claimed yesterday, when journalists asked him about this, because there were some news lines not covered by the mainstream media, but covered by other alternate sources, that he was presented with the new facts about the number of bullet holes found in Hind's car. And he said, well, Israeli soldiers told us that they weren't there at the time, which of course that's absurd. I mean, there's satellite imagery of Israeli tanks. Hind herself, a 6-year-old girl, and Layan are both saying there's tanks. I mean, it's just like completely ridiculous at this point to try to repeat that lie. And then he says, well, they've tried to reach out to the Palestine Red Crescent, and I forget the other, or maybe it was the UN, and neither of them got back to them. And of course, Prem Thacker from The Intercept reached out to the Palestine Red Crescent, and they said, we never heard from them.
Right.
So they're just lying repeatedly, and he's repeatedly, acting as a stenographer for them, not even questioning anything they're saying. And I should mention, I mean, you said, like, you guys did this investigation, the US could. With Shireen Abu Aqla, a US citizen, we went and we spoke with all of the eyewitnesses, her colleagues who were with her. We did, extensive interviews with them for a documentary that my program did as well. And then the US continued, under the Biden administration, continued to defer to the Israeli investigation. And then when we asked those same eyewitnesses, did the Israeli military speak with you? They all said no. What kind of investigation doesn't include interviews with the main eyewitnesses who were there? So, I mean, that tells you all you need to know about these Israeli investigations that the U.S. is continually deferring to.
Yeah. And can I just say that just because earlier we had the clip of Wissam Hamada, Hind's mother, talking, and it was in Arabic with subtitles, but just for those who are listening, Wissam Hamada was talking about what happened on that day, how the family decided to go back to the north. She talked about how the process of decision making, when you know that every decision could end up getting you killed, no matter what you do, you don't know what is going to be the thing. Do you flee? Do you stay? Do you try to go north? Do you stay where you are? and just she describes the process of trying to make that momentous decision, and it's just devastating. It's absolutely devastating. So yeah, Nora, you wanted to, and again, reacting. I mean, what you're saying, Laila. Of course, we know the US could do this kind of investigation, could do much more with its resources, but they've made a decision to allow this genocide to proceed, to assist it, and not to ask too many questions about it.
Right. And along with that is the corporate media that, I mean, there is irrefutable evidence now that at least 355 rounds were pumped into the car that killed Hind Rajab and her family. And it has yet to be reported by, the so-called paper of record, of course, the New York Times, and any other media outlets. I mean, how do we even, and then as you said, like Matt Miller, is saying, oh, we've asked the Israelis to investigate themselves. That's what he says every single day up there. I mean, how do we even assess the level of gaslighting that is being perpetuated not just by the Israelis and their media apparatus, but echoed and parroted and supported by the US and its media apparatus?
One thing that stands out to me in the process of making The Night Won't End is this execution that we feature in our film is not the only reported execution in that area at that time. There were at least two other stories of executions of two other families, the Khalidi family and the Kilani family, within just a few days span in mid-December. We weren't able to report those out, unfortunately, just due to limitations of time. But I spoke with a local journalist in Gaza, and I said, because he had reported on the Khalidi execution, and he was telling me everybody he spoke with. And he said, the neighbor said he heard something. And I said, oh, did you interview the neighbor? He said, no, I didn't interview the neighbor because he didn't see anything. He only heard. And it made me think, wow, if only the New York Times journalists who reported on alleged mass rape in an article that they put on the front page that ended up completely falling apart and yet remains on their website had the ethics of this journalist who said, I did not interview him because he didn't see anything, he only heard. Imagine.
Yeah.
And yet these journalists in Gaza are totally, demonized, discredited, dismissed as unreliable narrators of their own mass killing. There's a complete lack of solidarity with them in the face of this record number of, journalists killed and targeted, as well as their families. And, it's just galling. And I agree. I mean, the mainstream media, for the most part, there's exceptions here and there, has failed in the coverage of what's happening in Gaza. Sometimes it's failed because of not covering stories, and other times it's failed almost seems like too gentle because it's been outright complicit in the propaganda campaign in terms of pushing out official Israeli narratives.
Should we take a look at, there's a clip, I believe you're referring to the Salem family, the execution, and this was just utterly harrowing sequence. It really brought back to my mind, I remember now 42 years ago, I was a child, but the images from Sabra and Shatila refugee camps that were in Time magazine and Newsweek, and I remember going over again and again and looking at them, and are indelibly marked in my mind. And these images that we saw, these were video, not still images of the bodies, reminded me so much of that. But why don't we take a clip of, take a look at the clip, Tamara, focusing on the Salem family.
معهم كل الإمكانيات وأنت مدني أعزل لا تملك إشي وما سويت حاجة، وبلحظة إنه ينعدم أغلب قرايبك. عمي وابن عمي وكان جوز أختي من نار العشري، وكان في برضه اللي هو ولاد أختي اللي هو ولاد الشهيد اللي استشهد فيهم. فقلت أنا أخويا أمين الله يرحمه أكبر مني بسنتين، ما له أي دعوة لا في مقاومة ولا بضرب طلب. ما ظنيت إن في بني آدم يعني ممكن ينسى موقف زي هيك.
The Israeli military did not reply to questions regarding the attack.
And that, just for those who are listening, that was one of the survivors of the massacre, standing in the apartment. He's filmed in the apartment where the massacre takes place, and he's actually showing us where it happened and how it happened. It's part of a longer sequence. We, of course, are not going to play the video that shows the aftermath of the massacre here, but it is in your film. And then he's listing, as the photos show of his family members in happier times, he's listing all the members of his family who were murdered, executed in cold blood in this massacre. The men were stripped down, executed with gunshots to the head, the worst possible atrocity imaginable. And he goes through all the members of his family who were murdered in that massacre. Laila, what can you tell us about just your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I haven't gotten this massacre out of my head since I first heard about it. And sitting and transcribing the interviews was like this out-of-body experience. I remember this one, it was like a Friday night, and my children were in their martial arts class. It's not taekwondo, they do a different kind, but they were in their martial arts class, and I was like in the office where they do martial arts, like transcribing this interview, and I just felt like, what is this world we live in where I'm in this martial arts class and I'm listening to literal scenes out of a horror movie. I mean, what happened to the Salem family is like the worst possible horror movie you can, like literally it's worse than a horror movie, worse than anything a horror movie director or writer can think of. And it was just this, I think in some ways it was kind of this moment where I think a lot of us have felt this, which is like we're here, we're in our lives, we're able to somehow, eat and sleep and live in this safety, especially if you're Palestinian and you just feel like that could have been me, that could have been my family. And I think one detail that hasn't left my mind is Uday, who's the other survivor. We saw Yahya in this clip, but Uday is another young man. And both of them say, they're like, we don't know how we're alive. The soldiers thought they were dead. They both passed out. So it's very likely the soldiers thought they were dead. And that's the only way they were able to survive. But Uday talks about how his father, Ayman, and I went back and I looked at Ayman's Facebook page, and there's something so eerie about looking at someone's Facebook page after they've been killed in this horrific way. His last post was like about the last Ramadan in 2023, and just all of his photos and, under a tree smiling, like he just lived this like totally normal life and just seemed like such a sweet man. His family talks about him making like falafel for them for dinner. They just lived this really simple life as a family, and they took him up a flight of stairs and told him to knock on the neighbor's door and make up some lie or some story to get the neighbors to come out. Basically at gunpoint, they took him to do this. He didn't want to, but he did. He told them, he said whatever he needed to say. And then apparently after that, they pushed him and threw him down the flight of stairs. And there's something about that detail of him being pushed down a flight of stairs that just like hasn't, just made me completely just start like sobbing. Just to think of this man and like the way that they take away your dignity, your life. They did all this in front of his family. You mentioned like they stripped them down to their boxers. They made the women strip. Just talk about sexual abuse, right? Talk about humiliation. The way that they humiliated these people, and these families just kept saying over and over again, we're civilians, we're civilians. And I can tell you what ties all of these stories together is that there is no innocent Palestinians for the Israeli military that's operating in Gaza. They knew these people were civilians. One of the survivors told us that they'd been shelled and attacked and besieged for 5 days leading up to this massacre. And she said, we couldn't use the bathroom, we couldn't eat, we couldn't drink water because they were like surrounding them and just shooting at them. And she said, no one ever fought back. They knew who we were. And yet they came in and they acted in this, inhumane, horrific, there's just no words, monstrous, savage, barbaric way. And I think, we obtained two very graphic, disturbing videos of the aftermath of that massacre where you actually can see the men unclothed in their bodies after they'd been executed. We show one of the videos, but I felt very strongly that, and I kept pushing for this, but that we were going to see them as they were living as well. I didn't want the men to just be bodies. I wanted the audience to see that these were people and they had loved ones who are mourning them and grieving them and missing them. And that's why we had that sequence with their photos, because I wanted everyone to know who those bodies were. And the last thing I wanted to say is, I just lost my thought because I was just thinking about that point of making sure the audience knew who these men were. But unfortunately, I don't think our film even skims the surface of the crimes that have taken place in Gaza. I think there are many, many, many atrocities that have happened, and executions and war crimes that have taken place that we don't even know about. And I hope they come to light at some point. And it's not the lack of trying of the journalists on the ground. They're doing their best, but there's only so much they can cover. And they're also being systematically targeted and killed. But yeah, sorry, that was a long answer.
No, absolutely. It's what you were saying about, us who are so far away, and there's this disconnect. It's a very surreal feeling of, taking care of your kids, going to work, going to the grocery store, going to a baseball game, things that are just, considered normal life here. And then also working, with your colleagues who are going through the most unspeakable time. I
want to say one thing about that.
Yeah.
That day that I transcribed that interview, I just started sobbing, like I said, and sorry.
Yeah.
Sometimes I felt like as a mom, I wasn't present at all, because how do you hear stuff like that and then just be normal? But I had just been crying so much, and I was leaving, the martial arts place, and this mom just looks at me and she's like, "Are you okay?" And, all I could say is like, Gaza. And then she just says, "Oh, why? Do you have family there?" And I don't know why. There's just something about that question that triggered me so much, because I'm like, those weren't my family, but I'm so upset.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to have family or be personally connected to be appalled and horrified about what's happening there. And I just, all I could say is like, no, this is about humanity. Obviously I do have family there, but that this is just about people, anybody. It doesn't have to be your family member. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right.
That really bothers me.
Absolutely. And there's also this way in which, and I think your film does an incredible job of counteracting this, where Palestinians are, if they're thought of at all, in mainstream discourse, in the narrative, and in the corporate media. They're just kind of hapless victims, and they're not afforded the dignity of telling their story and of understanding their full humanity as parents, as teachers, as doctors, as resistance fighters, even. And I think that it's so important, the way that you re-dignified these people who are trying to survive. Just, I mean, day after day. I keep thinking about the massacres that happened in Beit Lahia earlier today, right? And how these people had probably survived countless other massacres somehow, and today, almost 9 months into this, they're trapped under rubble. They didn't survive this one. I mean, how do we even begin to process the scale of this?
Yeah, I mean, one detail that we couldn't include in the film is that some of the people who survived that massacre on December 19th were killed in airstrikes during Ramadan. And it just, like, when I found that out, I was just like, how do you survive something like that December 19th massacre and see your loved ones be killed like that and humiliated and be beaten and injured and all of that? And then they were killed in airstrikes later. And, one woman I spoke with, she had, I believe, 8 children. 5 of them were killed.
Jesus.
So she had 3 sons and her husband killed on December 19th. And then she had 2 daughters killed in an airstrike during Ramadan. And she told me, I asked her, how old are you? And she said, she's in her late 40s. And she said, I was so young when I became a mom, when I got married. I grew up with my children. And now, she's lost most of them. She lost her husband. And I should say that these people who spoke with us also are so courageous, because a lot of them are convinced that if they speak to the media, they're going to be killed by the Israeli military, that they're going to be targeted. And I pray to God that doesn't happen. But there's a lot of fear about speaking about, especially about these atrocities. A lot of fear. I can't even tell you.
Yeah.
And it's justified. I mean, it's justified fear, and I think it puts all of us in the position also of worrying about, if we speak with someone, if we interview someone, are we endangering them potentially? And I think the answer to that is that it is their choice, but nobody takes these decisions lightly, and you have to give people that opportunity and also not do it lightly. Also talk to them, make sure that there is that certainty. But people do feel compelled to speak and tell what happened. And I think what you did, Laila, with this film, you and your colleagues, is, I think, as Nora said it, you gave people back the dignity which Israel has stolen from them. And we see that in, like, just the fact that people are not able to have proper funerals in Gaza. Even those whose bodies are recovered, people are being buried in medians in the middle of roads because there's no space. They're being buried in makeshift graves. People cannot hold a condolences to receive people to give condolences. People are robbed of all the rituals that provide dignity and comfort and support for the family in the midst of this genocide. And it was striking, the dignity with which everyone spoke in the film and the way you showed them. And that is very moving and very important. And yesterday I was reading Gaza Writes Back, the book edited by our dear friend Rafah Al-Arian, longtime former contributor to the Electronic Intifada, who was murdered by Israel on December 6th. And it's far, reading it, it's almost prescient, where he talks about there's almost sort of a fatalism that death will come for you in Gaza. It's everywhere. And yet people are still determined to live and to tell their stories. And he says that the way we fight back against this is to tell the stories. And just watching your film while next to reading 𝐓𝐻𝐿's words, you really did justice to his invocation. And I just want to say personally, I can't thank you enough for it, as difficult as it is to do. It's so vital.
Thank you. I mean, it feels like it's the absolute least we can do, given what people are going through. And, I think we live in a society that's constantly telling us that we should accept Palestinian, the dehumanization of Palestinians. But I remind myself that if all of this was happening to other people, it would be front page news. We would be getting alerts on our phones. People would care. People would express outrage. Ali, what you mentioned about where people are being buried, or the lack of being able to have funerals, or all of that would be a story. It's like we're just being told every single day from every lever of power in our society that this is something that's just normal, right? Palestinians starving to death, normal. Palestinians being executed in cold blood, normal. All of this. And I think it's our job, every fiber of our being needs to just absolutely reject that and say it's not normal, and we're going to be sounding the alarm. And every single journalist should feel the exact same way and should do their jobs, frankly, just like they would cover anything else.
And the thing that I also lost the thread of something I wanted to say when I was reading 𝐓𝐻𝐿's words, and he would go on with others, with Ahmed al-Na'ouq and Rami Abdu and the many, many young people they worked with in Gaza, and the volunteers in the United States and other countries to found We Are Not Numbers, to tell this story. The title of the project, We Are Not Numbers. And those words really struck me as so appropriate in watching this film, because it is so easy, even for us as Palestinians, to start to think of the victims in Gaza as numbers. We say 37,000, 38,000, 40,000. It becomes abstract. It becomes impossible to absorb what these numbers mean. And telling their stories, giving people the chance to speak. While this is happening, as you said, Laila, they are still living through the genocide, surviving through the genocide. And the reality no one can hide, is the people that we see in the film interviewed may not be there in a week. I'm not saying something that they don't know. And but that's what screamed out for me. We are not numbers. They are not numbers. And the enormity of the crimes can only really be, in our limited human brains, can only be absorbed when we look at individual stories of individuals and families in depth. And you did it with such power.
Thank you. I do think there's a power in the specificity of naming a family, naming everybody we see, and seeing, their life before everything happened. I thought this was a choice of the director, my colleague 𝐄𝐥𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐿, to start the film with the sea and sort of how Hiba and her family like to spend their time when they wanted to relax and have fun as a family. And I just thought that was so humanizing and so beautiful and so relatable. And like I said, I think we just live in an environment, in a society that wants us to think that that's not the experience of Palestinians, and we need to push back against that as much as possible.
Laila Al-Arian, you are an award-winning journalist and the executive producer fault lines. The film, again, is called The Night Won't End, and people can find that on YouTube. It was just age restricted, of course. So it's going to be really important.
Yeah.
Sorry?
It'll be a little bit harder to find, but
harder to find, but all the more important for people to find it and share it, and organize watch parties, and anything you can do. It's super important. So The Night Won't End. We also have a direct link on Asa's blog post that was published earlier this week. Laila, thank you for all of your work, and can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much, Laila.
And you're watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Ali Abunimah, and we're going to bring Jon on at this point. Hi, Jon.
Hi, guys. That's incredible. Great work by Laila.
Yeah. That's an extraordinary documentary.
Extraordinary documentary.
Yeah.
A historic one. So
Historic,
congratulations to them for doing it. And again, what she said is so true. The Palestinian journalists on the ground, the population themselves, the resilience, the resistance of people underneath this brutal last 9 months is, it's beyond words. So,
It
really
really
had her on.
Jon, I don't want to take away from the extraordinary achievement that this film is to make a film like this in these circumstances. But what angers and enrages me is why isn't everyone else, why aren't all the other networks doing it?
Oh, it's all right there.
It's all right there. And then also, why isn't Hillary Clinton tweeting it out and saying, watch this? Why isn't Donald Trump tweeting it out and saying, watch this? And Joe Biden? Why isn't the White House holding an event to screen it as they did with Sheryl Sandberg's mass rapes, atrocity propaganda hoax film? It's hard to hold in one's emotions. I'm sorry.
It's absolutely.
Yeah, no, it feels like we're in an upside down world every day. All right. Well, Jon, there's a lot to cover. We're so glad that you've come back from your travels and are going to talk to us about what's happening.
Live.
Yeah. Thank goodness. All right. Go for it.
Thanks, guys. And as I'm stunned as well by that. That was just an incredible presentation and incredible documentary. And as Nora so well articulated at the beginning of this show, the attacks are all over Gaza. They're from the north to the south. The artillery, the airstrikes go on, regardless of where the resistance battlefield is at any given moment. But we'll just look at the resistance battlefield now, which is particularly in the south. We'll look at these two maps here. We've got a map of the full Gaza Strip, so you can see the locations that Nora was talking about that are being struck, the middle camps, the north, Khan Yunis, places that the battlefield, that haven't been a battlefield in some cases for months, but the attack is on civilians. And that's always been the case. And that's always something that I want to begin my segments with, is by saying that. But the amazing job that Laila did, I don't think I need to say that this time. So let's just get right into it. We're going to focus in on this map here. Shows us in the Rafah area. I talked last week on the show about the Philadelphia corridor. That's the border corridor that runs between Rafah and Egypt. So if you didn't catch that last week, check it out. We won't focus on that this week. The resistance has been in Tel Sultan. You can see there on the west side, and particularly in Al-Shabura camp. This is all Rafah refugee camp, as I told you before. The entire refugee camp. This is an entire refugee camp, and the locals give each neighborhood a different name for the camp. So Tel Sultan and Al-Shabura are all part of the Rafah refugee camp. And you can see the Rafah crossing down there that's been closed since May 6th, which is just deepening the famine. That's the onset of the famine that's been brewing in Gaza by this being used as a weapon of war. It's just appalling. And it's largely because the Rafah crossing down in the south has been closed, and the Kerem Shalom crossing is just further towards Israel along that border as well, and it's been closed, which has made aid really difficult. And that's the thing about Rafah, is that it was people's safe place, quote unquote. It was always the subject of airstrikes and artillery, but at least the aid delivery was close and it was able to be given to people in the camps. Now people have scattered and the aid delivery is very difficult. So it's just a brutal situation, but we are going to focus on the resistance because the resistance is continuous. There's no signs of any kind of degrading of the resistance. The Israeli military chief of staff spoke the other day, and he said, "We are clearly approaching the point where we can say we dismantled the Rafah brigade. It is not defeated in the sense that there are no more fighters in it, but in the sense that it does not know how to function as a fighting framework." So we've got about 45 minutes for you here of the exact opposite of that. And the Israeli military claimed one death in the south. And so people can watch these videos and see if they're telling the truth about that, because as has been the case for this entire war, they're lying about that. So let's look at number one here, Tamara. This is in Tel Sultan. Another one of these. Pop open the door, steps out, and there's a tank right in front of him. Back door of the tank, where the ammo storage is, where the door of the crew cabin is, and he blasts it from 15 meters away with a weapon that penetrates 600 millimeters of armor, which is more than that door. And you can just see the proximity. It's just incredible. The fighters have been doing this the entire time, from the north to the very south. And this is what we're looking at, the very south. Just incredible. They're able to get into position like that and fire on the back door of the tank. It's the weakest spot. And as I said, the infantry is in the crew cabin right behind that door. So the Israeli military said that 2 soldiers from the 401st Armored Brigade's 46th Battalion were seriously wounded during fighting on this day that we're watching here. So I think that you're at least looking at that in the defense of Rafah here. Again, you can see it's an entire tank column. If the fighter had looked the other direction, I bet you there's a tank in the other direction as well, pointing at him. But as we always see, the fighters fire and get out of there immediately and return to their base safely and become better fighters, which is obviously a very important part of this story that we're going to be covering for years. Is the skill of these fighters is going to be applied to the resistance going forward for the next generations. Again, you can just see the proximity of that. It's pretty remarkable. Absolutely no way any kind of active protection system can engage. Let's look at number 2 here, Tamara. This is a fighter on a rooftop with an elevated strike on a Merkava tank. There you can see this the cameraman / spotter. The cameraman aren't just cameraman; they're also spotters. He gets his finger on this lens. Some people were talking online about whether that was an interception. I don't think that's an interception from the active protection system. Usually you'd see a flare. If that was the case, when you don't see a flare, you're often looking at a penetration from a tandem charged warhead. The point is to just have one piece of it pierce through the armor, and then it rattles around the inside of the tank cabin where all the soldiers are. But again, we're seeing fighters using the landscape. This is their town. They know how to move around and get these shots. So salute to that spotter and his finger there on that one. Let's go to number 3. This is now these were both in Tel Sultan camp on the western side. So here we have a commander, as the Israeli military is telling us that the command and control, that they don't function as a military framework. And here we see a commander ordering his troops. He's saying all of our units in the area, he's showing the map to his fighters, will focus on the enemy forces invading Al-Shabura camp on Al-Aqsa Street. According to the plan, the enemy forces will be lured into the ambush and dealt with directly. We will then transition to targeting the reinforcements that will arrive in the area. So you're clearly seeing commanders issuing orders to their fighters, functioning as a military organization. There's a great shot of the Yasin Archer there from the side. We don't see the vehicle in that, but these next 3 videos that we're going to see are this ambush. So again, this is the commander talking to his units. He says all nodes, all combat nodes. So what we're seeing with each of these camera shots is all the various combat nodes. I'm translating that as units, but you can see there's a different cameraman there. And each cameraman isn't just standing by himself. He's with a squad, probably with another person, a shooter. And you can see there's a different camera spot there. So we're seeing the multiple nodes within this area. You can see they're just, the proximity to that tank is less than a building away, working through the alleys, same way as all Palestinian camps from the north in Jenin, north of the West Bank, all the way to the southern tip of Rafah. The fighters move through these alleys that the Israelis created with their ethnic cleansing in 1948 and subsequently, and the fighters are using that terrain to their benefit in these battles, and have all through multiple generations of fighting, but of course particularly the Second Intifada and this battle here, we've seen them moving through these alleyways to get these shots, and then again you see the fighter instantly getting up and moving to get back to his base safely. So again, we're just going to keep in mind that commander talking about the different combat nodes as we watch these next couple of videos here. So let's do number 4. Al-Shabura camp is in the center, central Rafah. That's an Eitan wheeled armored personnel carrier. That's, I believe, the first time we've seen them in urban combat inside the cities. We've seen them out in the buffer zone. They're a new vehicle. There we see another shot of it there. It's an 8-wheeled vehicle. It's an armored vehicle that's not as heavily armored as an armored troop carrier or a tank. So these shots from very close with the Yasin, very curious to see how the Eitan stands up to these Yasin strikes that we know penetrate the Merkava and the Namr, which are both more heavily armored than that vehicle. And again, right through the alleys, look at the proximity. These like reach out and touch it. And he blasts it from that spot and hits right in the center of the crew cabin, where there's 9 soldiers in that Eitan fighting vehicle in the middle of it. So we can watch it again. You can see just the level of the coordination, right? Remember the commander said all combat nodes are going to focus on the ambush on Al-Aqsa Street. So their fighters are luring the Israelis into this by firing on them, using the alleyways. Look at the way this guy uses the alleyway, multiple alleyways to get away from return fire and to lure the army to follow them. And they follow them into the ambush that's been planned by their commander on a video screen. Whatever the opposite of not functioning as a military framework is what we're watching here. We're watching a detailed ambush. That first was with a tandem 85. This is a Yasin 105. Again, firing on the back door. And this guy's going to fire right in the middle of the crew cabin on this one. The Qassam field report said it was 2 Eitans, but we're seeing 3. So it's possible that there's a broken telephone between the fighters in the field and the field reporting, or one of those Eitans got 2 Yasin strikes. So that would be even more interesting to see. But of course, the Israelis don't give us battle damage assessments, and they lie about their casualties. And so we don't totally know the result of all of these particular operations, as has always been the case. And just one note about these Eitans before we turn to the next video. Yeah, let's watch it one more time. These Eitans, they haven't been put into service. On October 7th, they were not in service for the IDF. They were supposed to be deployed next year into service, but they rushed them into service. So no one had seen one of these vehicles in Palestine before October 7th. And the Israelis invaded 20 days later. And when they got to the Jabalia camp, the edge of the Jabalia camp, on the eastern edge of the camp, they raided a Qassam training site. And the training site, I remember I showed you guys back, this would have been 8 months ago, they had a model of the 𝐴𝐻𝐻. They had the fighters were training on a model of the 𝐴𝐻𝐻 that hadn't existed, hadn't been deployed, wasn't going to be deployed for a year and a half after it rushed into service, more than a year early. But when the Israeli army went to the training camp, got to the training camp, they found, and they showed it off. The Israelis showed it off. Look at this model. Another one of the times that the Israeli propaganda is so odd, because it's just showing how professional and organized this resistance is. These are not just guerrilla fighters grabbing a gun and running down to the street. They're training on these vehicles before the vehicle is even deployed into service. So that's the first we've seen. There's a bunch of firsts this week, but that's the first we've seen the 𝐴𝐻𝐻s in urban areas fighting. So interesting to see how they hold up. Number 5 tomorrow here. Same ambush. This is the same ambush the commander was talking about. Fighters within spitting distance of a Merkava here. You can see the cameraman's communicating with him here. We take the audio out, but he tells him here, you can see him pat him on the shoulder here. He's saying, retreat. And then they see this soldier get out. He dismounts here, something we basically never see. Not clear why he's doing this. It seems like he was maybe injured, maybe out of the back of the 𝐴𝐻𝐻. We don't know. One of the things we'll have to ask the fighters after, because you can see there he's being helped away by another soldier there. He appears to be wounded, and he appeared to be dismounting from high up, which would make sense that he was dismounting from the 𝐴𝐻𝐻, which isn't a tracked vehicle, it's a wheeled vehicle, which might mean that it's a higher door for them to get out. So I think that's what we're seeing there, is an injured soldier exiting the 𝐴𝐻𝐻. And the fighters are yelling because they're in their voice. You can watch it on my Twitter feed with the audio in, the shock, just the utter shock of the fighters that the Israeli soldiers actually out of his tank. They just never see them out of their tank. They never dismount, unless they're going into a house to massacre a family like Laila described, right? Then they're very tough. Then they're very push people down the stairs because they're strong guys then. But when they're out here on the streets fighting the battles, they're the most cowardly fighters. And that's just what just even enrages you even more about the massacres that Laila was talking about. And you can hear in the voice of the fighter just how shocked they are 9 months into this war that an Israeli soldier is actually in a battle space out of their armored vehicles, which for most militaries is how you escort armored vehicles, is outside of the vehicles with infantry walking alongside, so that fighters can't step out of the alleyway like 𝐶assam does here and fire on your armored vehicle and burn it up from the inside. But the Israelis they'd rather rely on their technology and hope that their armor is strong enough. And we know from last week's hit on the Namr troop carrier that killed 8 soldiers at once, it's not the best, doesn't appear to be the best strategy for protecting their fighters, for protecting their soldiers. But it's what they do. People ask in the comments all the time, like, why are they not dismounted? Lots of soldiers in the comments talking about it, because a soldier, that fought in Iraq or something, that's in the infantry, they had to walk outside of the tanks, and they know what it's like and how scary it is to be in a battlefield, and how much courage these fighters that they're fighting against have. The Palestinians, again, just showing them here. And this fighter, you can see, pats him on the back and says, retreat, like let's get out of here. But he doesn't retreat first. He lets the shooter go by him. Just the chivalry of the fighters, I guess. You could see. So this is the ambush in full flight that the commander planned. And there we're seeing the soldiers being helped through on the street there. So that's the Al-Shabura ambush that was planned by that commander. That what we're seeing there is a Yassin strike on those soldiers, apparently. Again, we don't see the Yassin strike, but that's apparently what we're seeing there. So that's the Al-Shabura ambush, and that's 𝐶assam clearly fighting as an organized fighting force, proving that the Israelis are just lying again. Even their military chief of staff just lying like he's Matthew Miller, with the ease of Matthew Miller. Okay, let's look at number 11 here, because this is another surface-to-air missile. This is Soraya Al-Quds Islamic Jihad. We see them firing an 𝐄𝐥𝐞 SA-18. You can see him get it out of its package here and set it up. Once again, Soraya Al-Quds showing us the longer view of these operations that Qassam often cuts short. Sometimes we just wish that Qassam would just give us 15 seconds before and after the video that they are showing us, because you can see the fighter setting up and oiling his weapon here. It's an SA-18. It's one better than the SA-7s that they were firing. That's a photo of Jihad Ghanem. He was the Rafah Brigade commander for Soraya Al-Quds. He was killed in the 4-day war in May 2023 between Soraya Al-Quds and the Israeli military. So you see, again, fighters saluting their leaders, recognizing their history, just in little subtle ways, just like that, just show that. Now, these surface-to-air missiles, they look good. That's actually just a flare from the Apache helicopter, the Israeli Apache helicopter. The helicopters are more sophisticated than these surface-to-air missile systems, these man-portable systems that the Palestinians have. They're firing on them, but the helicopter can fire flares, and they're the surface-to-air missiles heat-seeking. So you can see the helicopter there dropping flares, and those flares will attract the surface-to-air missile. And this I just wanted to note in this, because some people were talking about it online, that because of the wording of Soraya Al-Quds, they say spotting an Israeli helicopter returning from the operation to evacuate the dead and wounded from the ambush of Soraya Al-Quds in the Al-Shabura neighborhood. And so people were sort of asking, is this the first time we've seen them firing on a medevac? And it's not. It's not that. This is a combat. This is an Apache attack helicopter. It's not a medevac helicopter. It has nothing to do with the medevac. So that's the key word. The key word is returning after the medevac, because the Apache would escort the medevac helicopter, and then the Apache turns around and comes back, and they fire on it. So these systems are there's something that the Israelis have to keep their eyes on. It's not useless. They're definitely not useless on a medevac helicopter that's down on the ground. And we clearly see that the resistance fighters do not target medevacs. We're now 9 months into this. We're going to see more on this show this week, that they're not attacking medevac helicopters. They're not attacking the medevacs. They're not even attacking the medevac jeeps that you're going to see later on. So even after all of this brutality, their apparent principles, they're fighting by their code still, despite their families being massacred, just all the brutality and destruction that they're witnessing all around them. But they're not attacking the medevac helicopters. And again, Jihad Ghanem, he's the Rafah Brigade commander for Soraya Al-Quds, and he was killed in the 4-day war in May. So that's interesting to see. Now, this is the one I think that people have been waiting for after we see this here. Let's go to number 12 tomorrow. So that's the missile hitting the flare, not the helicopter. So this is the first time we've seen this system here. This is an HJ-8 anti-tank guided missile. You can see it on a tripod. Just a couple of things to note here. Watch the soldiers milling about. Notice the fighter holding a manual there. He's holding a manual that's an anti-tank unit manual for the Rafah brigades. This is the first time we've seen this system, even in parades. Now you can see here the soldiers milling around behind the armored vehicle. And then we're going to see this from 3 different camera angles. So this is clearly an operation that had been set up probably for hours, tracking this crew. This Israeli military grouping is along the Philadelphia corridor, south of Tel Sultan, and you can see the wire-guided anti-tank missile there flying through the air. And this is a system. So this is the first time we've seen this system in Gaza. It was smuggled into Gaza. We've seen lots of smuggled weapons. That's not really surprising. And seeing a weapon like this is actually not that surprising to me. That's a pretty popular weapon. It's a Chinese weapon, People's Liberation Army anti-tank guided missile. It's of the same class as a Cornet or a TOW anti-tank missile, which we'll see later on in the show, that Hezbollah fires. So these, you can see the soldiers there scurrying after the hit. And these systems are tandem charged, the same principle as the Yasin. But you can see how big that system is and how heavy it is. It's a 25 kilo system. It's difficult to set up and take down, but you'll notice the fighter, as soon as he fires, as soon as he's locked on the target, so he has to wait till the target, but look at him right now. Look at him dismantling, immediately dismantling the system, taking it apart, because there's going to be return fire. So you don't admire your shot, and his manual, surely, that he's holding in his hands there, describes that. This is a fighting force operating like a trained military, using this system for the first time. This system's from the 1980s. It was updated in the 1990s after the Bosnia War with information from the Bosnia War, from the urban fighting, urban combat. So they made this system that we're seeing here that's a lightweight system. It's called lightweight, just compared to the system that would be attached to an armored vehicle or a helicopter. But it's not lightweight. 25 kilos. It takes 2 people to carry. It takes time to set up and time to dismantle. In an urban battle space, it's just not the best weapon to be using. And that's why Qassam didn't put their energy into smuggling as many Cornets or HJ-8 systems as they could. What they did was they applied an indigenous weapons manufacturing industry in Gaza to build thousands of Yasins, instead of just having a small number of these weapons that are definitely more powerful than a Yasin. This first of all, it shoots a farther distance. This is effective range of 2 kilometers, but 3 kilometers you could be using it up to, whereas the Yasin is a few hundred meters. And it also is a bigger warhead, and the warhead penetrates 50% more armor than the Yasin. So it's a significant weapon, but the warheads are sophisticated, and they're more difficult to make. They're more difficult to import. They're more difficult to smuggle. These weapon systems that we're looking at here, the HJ-8, they proliferated in Syria. So it's not surprising that this system isn't made its way to Gaza. But it is interesting to see it, because we haven't seen it before, and we see it in the hands of the Rafah brigade, and the fighter has in his hand a manual saying this is an anti-tank unit manual for the Rafah brigade. So it's, in that sense, it's interesting. The vehicle that it's hitting here, I believe this is a Namr troop carrier. Qassam identifies it as an 𝐓𝐿, which is a command and control vehicle that we don't see very often. And Qassam, but it has a carpet thermobaric demining system on the back. We saw one of these vehicles get hit in Khan Yunis, and it made a massive fireball. You can see that the square thing on the back there, that's a demining system that fires thermobaric rockets into the air. And then a fuel air explosion, it essentially runs out like a string, and it will detonate any IEDs, improvised explosive devices, buried. Look at the fighter immediately taking it down. You can see Israeli soldiers in behind there. You can see them around. You're going to see a Caterpillar front-end loader come and put sand on the burning vehicle. So that carpet system is attached to Namrs. But I'm gonna defer to Qassam on this one, because these guys were clearly watching this operation unfold, and it's possible that there was a carpet system on an 𝐓𝐿 that we have never seen before. So we'll give it to Qassam on this one and say it's an 𝐓𝐿. In any case, all of the vehicles, the 𝐓𝐿, the Namr, the Merkava, they use the same chassis, they use the same hull. So effectively, they're the same vehicle. When we're looking at this from 3 kilometers away, we can't really see the distinguishing elements of it. There you see the bulldozer pouring sand on the burning vehicle. And again, Caterpillar, Peoria, Illinois. And so we've seen lots of smuggled weapons. Let's show it one more time tomorrow. So the fighter's here, he's saying, the fighter's saying, on audio, he's saying, "We will strike with vehicles of the enemy now. O Allah, guide us our aim and make our feet firm. This work is sincere and dedicated to the souls of our martyrs and our steadfast people in the displacement camps." So always constant connection by these fighters to their fighter leadership, their historic leadership, but always to their people. They're always saluting their people, always saluting the people who are struggling, like Laila's documentary so well shows, struggling in a separate battlefield than the fighters. And these fighters' families are all being killed. And it's just, if you watch it on my Twitter feed, if you go watch the video on my Twitter feed, the absolute joy of these fighters successfully firing this system for the first time in Gaza in battle, because they don't train on these systems because they don't have enough missiles to just be firing this. They don't train on them because they need all of the stocks of the missiles. Whereas the Yassins, they make training rounds for the Yassins so that the fighters can learn how to use them. So it's just interesting to see the fighter holding that Rafah Brigade manual for an anti-tank unit, and then seeing him use a system that has never been seen before in Gaza. Often we see these weapon systems in parades beforehand, but of course there hasn't been a battle in Rafah in 17 years. And so this system from the 1990s, it's possible this system's been in Gaza for many years. But usually they would show it off at a parade, and we never saw any of these in a parade. So you can see 3 camera angles, direct hit, and then look at the fighter immediately taking it down. But you can see by how he's taking it down just how cumbersome that system is compared to what we saw with the Yassin, where the guy pops the door open, steps out, blasts a tank from 10 meters away. This system is dangerous. It's dangerous in urban warfare because it takes time to set up. Takes time to dismantle. The Israeli military can track where it was fired from and return fire, but we see 𝐐𝐤𝐿 successfully using it here. And again, you can see the soldiers dismounted. They're all walking outside. No casualties in southern Rafah reported on the 24th of June or 25th of June or 23rd of June. So it seems like miraculously those soldiers that we see all milling about as a fragmentation warhead explodes on the vehicle and starts a fire, they're all apparently not counted in the casualty reports. So again, so this system, it's the same system, it's the same class of system as a Kornet. We've seen Kornet strikes. It's a better anti-tank system than Concours, which is also something we've seen fired, and it's also better than the Mailutka that Islamic Jihad has fired. So there's many anti-tank guided missiles that we've seen fired in Gaza. So it's not that surprising to see this weapon be used. Sure, let's do it one more time, Tamara. Let's do it for the sake. This is pretty remarkable. Again, you can see him holding here, and he's in this position where he's vulnerable. And he takes the time to say, this is for our people in the camps. He's not even saying the martyrs of our fighters. He's talking about his people. And it's not clear that he's holding that manual to show it off. He was probably literally using it just to make sure that he got his calibration exactly right. He's in the anti-armor unit, so he's trained on this weapon system in all aspects, except for the firing part, which I believe that this might be the first time that they actually have launched this system on their own. Because like I said, the missiles are the difficult part to replace. And so 𝐐𝐤𝐿 made this critical decision at some point in history, like around 2005, whether they were, or 2006, when Hezbollah used Kornets to anti-tank weapons to such great effect in the July 2006 war, that 𝐐𝐤𝐿 could have said, let's do Kornets. Let's smuggle as many Kornets as we can into Gaza, and let's set up all our units to use Kornets to destroy tanks, because they're more effective at destroying tanks. But because they're cumbersome, because they're heavy, because they take 2 people to carry, because they have to be dismantled, they're not as advantageous as the Yassin is. You just make many more Yassins and you fire many more of them at the military. Your fighters return to their base safely. And so it's very interesting. It's interesting that we don't see as many anti-tank guided missiles in Gaza And the reason for that is because it was a strategic decision made by Qassam, and history is going to record it, because history is going to record the use of the Yasin tandem charge warhead built in Gaza that's repeatable. It's something that's repeatable. And now that Israel has fired 50,000 bombs on Gaza, and however many hundreds of thousands of tank shells and 155 shells that Laila was talking about that massacred the children, all of these unexploded, if it's a dud rate of 5%, you're talking about thousands of unexploded weapons that can all be repurposed and put into Yasins and into rockets and into IEDs. They can't be put into Cornet missiles that require more more mechanized and technological fabrication for it. So very interesting. Could probably do a whole show on that, but you can see there the Caterpillar front end loader putting the sand to put the fire out, with the dismounted soldiers still all around. So that's pretty remarkable. HJ-8 Chinese anti-tank guided missile, probably from Syria. First time we've seen it used, and it has 50% more armor penetration than a Yasin that we know penetrates tanks. So if there was anyone in that tank when it's hit, that armored vehicle, when it's hit, it's devastating to the people inside. Let's look at number 13 here, because this is another ambush that shows that it's not just Qassam that's still fighting as a military force. This is Saraya Al-Quds still operating as a military force. We are going to see on this show all the fighting groups, because I threw in something from everybody this week. So this is a fighter in a tunnel preparing a barrel bomb IED, which is a massive bomb. And the fighter says, "We will lure you, stupid ones, to where you do not know and strike you where you do not expect." And you can watch this Merkava tank here is going to blow up just as it disappears from the tunnel-placed IED. And then again, even the cameraman's getting out of the way there. So you can see the tank going right where they predicted. And then they're going to follow this up with an RPG strike that you're going to see here. So that tank gets hit, disabled. The Israeli army sends another vehicle in, that you can see that piece flying over it. They send another vehicle in to bail out the vehicle that just got smoked. And the fighter steps out of the alley and blasts that vehicle. So now you got two vehicles being hit. No casualties from a barrel bomb that could literally be hundreds of kilos of explosives that are taken from the inside of Israeli and American bombs. So they're high-grade explosives, the highest grade explosives. And you can put in a barrel bomb, you can put as much as you can carry, as much as you can fill. And so to blow one of those up underneath a tank, it's devastating. And they're showing captured Israeli military equipment there. Captured gear, and then they're going to show us here a piece of their armored vehicle there, or a piece that might be from their ammo box. Then it says there but the ambush is not over yet. ... And then we get another SA-18 Igla fired at the Apache helicopter that comes to provide support for the two tanks that just got wiped out in this ambush. And the fighter says, "In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, these are the belongings of the enemy army which were taken over by Saraya Al-Quds Rafah battalion after the destruction of the vehicle." So Saraya Al-Quds ambush also in Al-Shpura neighborhood. So both the two major fighting units carrying out detailed ambushes with command and control, clearly showing them functioning not only as individual groups, but functioning together as a joint operations, in joint operations, as I've detailed over these last 9 months. That's what they do. They fight all together. They have all the same all the fighting groups from left to the jihadists. They all have the same principle about the ceasefire, about the prisoner exchange. They are in unity on those, and that's something that the Qassam brigades put a lot of work into the joint operations room so that the fighters could effectively operate together. So that's the battle in the defense of Rafah in the south. As Nora described, there was massacres in the middle camps and in Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis is just further north of Rafah, and then the middle camps just north of Khan Yunis. But the main fighting is in Rafah. But also, as we have been following every week for many months now, there's fighting on the Netzarim corridor. And if we look at map C here tomorrow, we can see the Netzarim corridor. Thanks again to Maxwell for throwing these maps together. It's very handy for everybody to see what we're talking about. You can see where the U.S. Army pier is in the Netzarim corridor. Last week on the show, I told you that the pier was gone. This week, the pier's back. In my notes that I made from a couple days ago, I said the pier is back, and then I crossed it out. So the pier is gone again because they dismantled it for a day to fix it. Now it's back again. By the time you watch this segment, maybe gone again. Unclear. It's all just cynical theater. Open the crossings, end the siege. The pier is ridiculous. It's not a military asset for the Americans or the Israelis. It's a piece of humanitarian theater happening during a famine and a genocide, and it's a cynical use of American resources. It bothers me. Sorry. So we're going to focus on the Netzarim corridor resistance here, because the Netzarim corridor is, as I've showed on previous shows, they have fixed military positions along. The Israeli military has fixed positions along this corridor that are just constantly under fire. Incidentally, the pier is not one of them. Palestinians are not interfering with aid coming in through the pier, despite the fact that the pier and aid trucks were used. At least aid trucks that looked like trucks that were used on the pier were used for the massacre in Nusrat. They also used in the massacre in Nusrat, they used a vehicle packed with belongings that they said were coming from Rafah for people fleeing. So just the perfidy of the Israeli military. But in any case, we're going to focus on the Netzarim corridor because this first operation here tomorrow, number 15, this is a Qassam Brigade's mortar operation. We see the Qassam fighters with eyes here on the IDF's 99th Division command post. You can see the vehicles going back and forth there. Qassam is going to set up 2 mortar teams here and fire on the command position with 60 and 120 millimeter heavy mortars. And then we're going to watch here. You can see them set up the shot, but after here, you're going to watch ambulances and medevac helicopters again show up, because the Israeli military in this case did admit casualties, 5 casualties in this operation, at least 2 killed, at least 3 severely wounded. So these mortar operations, which I don't show all that often on the show, but there's 7 videos a week like this, literally. And in the earlier war, there was even more. They're not just firing and closing their ears. These are, and we're going to see that in the coming footage. But you can see this is the medevac not being fired on. You can see that's the medevac ambulance not being fired on. We just saw that Qassam has mortar, that they've calibrated their mortars to hit these spots. And there goes a Sikorsky heavy helicopter. They have flares, but when they're coming up off the ground like that, you could hit them with one of those SA-18 Iglas that Sarai Al-Quds just showed us in the previous video. You could fire that on them, and they don't. You could fire sniper rifles. You could use the Al-Ghul sniper rifle, that has an effective range of 2 kilometers and has an incendiary round, armor-piercing incendiary round. If you put one of those rounds into the helicopter explodes. So it's very clear they're not firing on the medevacs. And that's the final scene there says the mortar fragments are waiting for you from Qassam. And this was along the corridor. And again, 5 casualties, 2 killed, 3 severely wounded, according to the Israelis, from that Qassam operation. We look at number 16 here is Qassam with 114 millimeter. These are Qassam's rocket artillery, built by Qassam. you can see them here setting it up, and it looks like they're just firing it off dirt, and they're not. We'll see in the coming videos how they calibrate this. But I just wanted to bring in this one quote from 𝐓𝐿 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐿. He's the secretary of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐿𝐈𝐧𝐙𝐢𝐜, and he says part of the reasons, which is right across the border from the Netzarim corridor, part of the reason we are not returning is the crisis of trust between the army and our residents, and we need to restore it. I would say that trust in the state should also be restored, but that will be more difficult. So that's the secretary, the settlement leader, the mayor, essentially, of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐿𝐈𝐧𝐙𝐢𝐜 saying that they're not going back to the envelope until the army reinstills trust in their institution that was dismantled by Qassam on October 7th. And we've been watching for 8 months as its only achievements are massacring civilians. But this is the kind of rocket fire you see right here, which is part of the reason why the Israelis are not going back to the envelope, the Gaza envelope, anytime soon. And that's why the country of Israel is smaller. It's smaller than it was on October 6th because of the envelope. It's smaller because of the north, where Hezbollah has made effectively a closed military zone that's 10 or 15 kilometers deep. So I just wanted to bring you that. Actually, the Magen David, the Israeli Red Cross, they did announce on this one that this was being fired on Ashkelon, just where everybody in Gaza is from, Ascalon, now called Ashkelon. So it was fired on them there, and the Magen David ambulance service said 2 people tripped and fell on their way to the shelter, which is something that, for people who have tracked this war for the last 20 years, will remember. The Israelis used to count their casualties so comprehensively that they would report trip and falls after rocket attacks. They would say, 16 trip and falls after that rocket attack on Tel Aviv. That was 10 years ago that they used to do that. We used to mock them for that. And now, 10 years later, they get hit so hard, so regularly, that they have to lie about their casualties. The opposite of acknowledging trip and falls, they lie about their casualties because there's no faith in their institutions. There's no faith in the IDF. They have a conscription army that they need people to have faith in, to go and fight, and to be forced to go and fight these wars that everybody, I think, will be pretty unanimously saying that the Israelis lost this war. Just the same way about the Americans in Iraq or Afghanistan, the Canadians for that matter. So yeah, let's look at number 17 here tomorrow, because this is where we can see, this is the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades, the PFLP. Here you see what they do. Qassam doesn't show this, but you can see the angle finder there. He's setting the angle finders, calibrating it. He's got a compass. He's got a map. With like a grid map, so that he can calculate where yesterday's shots landed. They have a spotter that calculates where the rocket artillery landed, and reports back, and they calibrate and they shift based on the compass, based on the map, on the mathematics. This is the mathematics of artillery, the mathematics of mortar fire. It's more complicated than I understand how they're doing it exactly. And even the mortar units tend to debate all of the different ways of calculating the math of how to execute an accurate mortar strike. But we saw 2 videos ago that they are accurate with these strikes. And these are fragmentation weapons, which means they explode into small pieces that fly all around. So they're dangerous, they're harassing. And this is the thing that 9 months into the war, these fighting groups are able to do. And this is the PFLP, the Marxists, fighting here with Saraya al-Quds, the Islamists, which is not unusual or surprising, even though it might sound that way to uninitiated audiences, that the leftists and the Islamists would fight together. But that's happened for decades. And there's leftists in Islamic Jihad as well. Often fighters will join a group, an organization, based on their military capacity or based on their relationships in the camps that they grew up in, or based on their role in the groups. So the armed groups aren't an effective way of strictly categorizing people's political beliefs, because there's many fighters from the PFLP that would join the Qassam brigades in the 2005, 2006, when Qassam is starting to build up a national army. You'd have leftists that would join the Qassam brigades, in the same way that you have leftists in the West Bank join Islamic Jihad in the Second Intifada, because Islamic Jihad had the resistance capability to carry out operations. So it's not just a simple way of categorizing people. And these joint operations aren't just for the cameras to show unity. This is actually what's happening. And these are being fired on the Netzarim corridor. All these videos are being fired on the Netzarim corridor. And you can see them calibrating their position, their firing positions, because they're moving their firing positions every day, whereas most mortar units are in a fixed place in normal armies. In other armies that have access to resources, your mortar units would be stacked with ammunition, and you would continually use that ammunition from a fixed position that you're firing from. But it's inverted in Gaza. In Gaza, they're firing a small number of ammunition from multiple different spots, but they're firing at the same target. So what you're seeing with the compass and the calibration and the angle finder is they're setting from multiple days of information to recalibrate the new position of the rocket. And they're putting the angle finder on the rocket so that the rocket launches on the right angle for the right trajectory to land where it's supposed to land. And that operation was the Israeli military admitted that operation. This is a video from the 16th of June that was only released a week later by the PFLP. And the Israeli military admitted that, it's this one, sorry. Is this 17 tomorrow? Yeah. Is this 17? Yeah, in any case, one of these two, 17 or 18, yes, there's Tamara. Thank you, Tamara. So this actually hit an Israeli howitzer, and the howitzers are the guns, the big guns that fire the 155 shells that Laila was talking about raining down on Hind. They fire these. This is what people are talking about when they talk about artillery. They're talking about a howitzer gun that's on the border in relative safety, firing into a camp full of people who have nothing to do with the battle, who are just trying to survive in a tent camp. And they're getting 155 shells rained down on them, made by the Americans, GPS guided. So they're landing exactly where they intend to land, right in the middle of a tent camp. And so this PFLP operation with Soraya, they hit one of those howitzers, and the Israeli military admitted that they lost those howitzers, that one howitzer. And those howitzers have fired hundreds of thousands of those shells since this war began. They had claimed that they had fired 100,000 155 shells, like in the first months, going back to late November, early December. The war only began as a ground war, October 27th, something around there. So you're talking about using thousands of these a day. So they were able to hit them. Is this number 18? These three videos essentially tell you the same thing, and it's interesting to see all three of those. Yeah, so you see here, he's got the compass on the mortar map, mortar math maps. You can see it there. It's magnetic, so it sticks to and they get the angle, they get the distance, they calibrate the distance, and then they attach the fuse. See, and then the fighters here with both their bandanas, the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades and Soraya Al-Quds, putting their bandanas there over the weapons. Is a very again chivalrous thing to do for each other, and they're saying that text there, saying they're firing on the Netzarim corridor. They're constantly going to fire on the Netzarim corridor. The Netzarim corridor is open season, and the longer the Israeli military stays in the Netzarim corridor, the more these operations are going to take place, and eventually, well, I won't predict the future. But the longer they're there, the more spectacular, large-scale operations that can take place if you give time, to dig your tunnels, which we just saw actually just before I came on air. 𝐓𝐡𝐞 released a video of them literally digging the tunnel right now. I have a deadline for 𝐓𝐡𝐞 of Tuesday night for the show, though, so we're going to have to show that one next week because it just came out. But you can see there the Netzarim corridor under fire constantly there. So thanks for that, Tamara. I got a little mixed up which one was which because there was 3 of them that were pretty similar, but they all have the same point, that those mortars are being shot with significant foresight, calibration, mathematics, geometry, a bunch of things that terrify me to try to explain to people. I hope I did an okay job for any of you mortar or artillery units out there listening. But that's the mortar and artillery operations on the Netzarim corridor. And that wraps up the resistance report for Gaza. But as I've been doing commonly, we're going to go to Lebanon and take a look at what Hezbollah's been doing. I always try to bring you the first time we see new weapons that Hezbollah brought out. So this first one, number 20 here, Tamara, is going to be the first time we have seen a first-person view, an FPV drone. This is something you see in the Ukraine a lot. We haven't seen it in the Israel battle space yet. This is the first time that we've seen it. And this is coming in here. We're watching. We're on board the attack drone here, and it's going to fly down and hit an anti-drone system called the Drone Dome. It's literally called the Drone Dome. It's made by Rafael, the major Israeli military industrial complex company. So Hezbollah uses their first FPV drone to destroy the system designed to defeat the Hezbollah drone that destroyed their system. These are very expensive systems being defeated here by a very cheap drone. And the fact that the drone is even flying at this point right here is a failure of Israel's multi-billion-dollar aerial defense array. But once it gets in close, that's when the Drone Dome is supposed to knock it down using electronic warfare systems, various types of jamming that's supposed to happen that just we don't see happen there. So it penetrates the multi-billion-dollar missile defense array that the United States and Israel have been, trying to establish for decades. It misses that. It misses their fighter jets that are flying through the air, constantly hunting for these. And then it penetrates deep enough to hit the Drone Dome, that's an electronic warfare system, and disables it. So this is in Metula. We're going to focus on Metula. Metula's in the Upper Galilee. This will be the first place of occupied Palestine that will come back to the Palestinians when Hezbollah takes the Galilee Panhandle, ultimately, at some point. And we're going to show a video here from, there's the Drone Dome. You can see a good shot of it there. And there you can see it landing beside that bird flying by. I watched it a bunch of times to try to figure out if we were looking at a second. It's just a bird, guys. It's not a second drone attack. Okay, so I don't ever do this I've done it a couple times. I showed you an Israeli television report when they were first establishing the Netzarim corridor. I've shown you a couple of Al Jazeera reports that when 𝐓𝐡𝐞 gives Al Jazeera footage, we show that. But I'm going to show you today a clip that I put together from 60 Minutes, the flagship news magazine program in the United States, hosted by Lesley Stahl. She's, at this point, pretty much the dean of American television journalism. She's the one, she's got a long history. And this is the first time this is a closed military zone. Metula is a closed military zone. The Israeli military is not letting anybody go into the area. No film crews are going in to film it, in large measure because it's all destroyed and the Israelis don't want people to see that. So it's a closed military zone that no one can access. But back in May, and I've reported on this a couple times, back in May, 60 Minutes did get access to Metula. And I'm going to show it to you. Let's watch it right now. It's number 21 tomorrow. Watch how they describe this. There's going to be volume.
Metula has been mostly abandoned by its residents. We saw an eerie scene as we drove through empty streets and no signs of life.
You can see we're going down.
We were told that the only residents left spend their days underground in this bunker complex. We met 𝐄𝐥𝐿 𝐄𝐥𝐜, a longtime Metula resident. She showed us a war room where other residents, including the town's mayor, monitor incoming attacks from the hillsides of Lebanon.
The hillside Lebanon?
It's Lebanon.
So Hezbollah?
Yes, this is Hezbollah.
The mayor, not the
eyes
idea.
Of everything
the mayor.
that's happening, and we give alerts to the army, and then the army comes.
Are you expecting in your mind that people will return to Metula eventually, or is this the way it's going to be forever? Do you
אז קודם כל תלוי איך זה ייגמר ומתי זה ייגמר. בסדר?
It depends on how it ends and when it ends. If this will be resolved only through agreement, it is safe to say that we assume that about 30-40% will not come back.
While filming, we were interrupted by an attack.
Okay, so there's another drone.
It was a drone rigged with explosives.
Another drone coming in. Sorry.
They moved us to another room.
Quickly, please.
We later learned that planes tried and failed to shoot down the drone. The explosion killed 2 soldiers in the Israeli Defense Force reserves.
Yeah. So the Israeli Defense Force reserves are those people that you just saw. The mayor, some civilian that stayed. That's what they're called. The Israeli military calls them reservists, even though they're obviously civilians and they're doing the work. She describes the woman describes being the eyes and ears of the IDF on the border, because the IDF's not on the border because they're scared to be on the border. They're scared to have positions on the border because they got hit so hard by anti-tank missiles early on in the going back to October 8th in the early stages of the war. So they've abandoned those positions. They've moved their military back from the border, and they leave these civilians as human shields for to be the eyes and ears of this, this military that's telling us that they're about to invade Lebanon. We're watching that in Metula, which would be a frontline place for Hezbollah. If they came across the border, they would take Metula, and there's no military presence in there. They're relying on the mayor in a bunker to tell them that there's a drone coming, and then they deploy the Israeli military. The Israeli Air Force deploys their fighter jets, their American fighter jets, to try to shoot down these drones, and they fail. And then these civilians then get counted as military when they get hit, which is what we're going to see here, number 22 tomorrow. This is a Tufan anti-tank guided missile. So this is the same class of missile. And you can see it's being fired at a building there. So sometimes when you see these Hezbollah videos, like Hezbollah didn't say that they hit. They don't always say what they hit. They'll say it's an Israeli military position. So we're seeing 2 anti-tank guided missiles hitting this position. And we see these videos all the time, and it looks like, oh, Hezbollah maybe just hit a house, And as Nasrallah always jokes, like, they're not just towers. When you're knocking out their eyes and ears, and all those strikes that Hezbollah hit, all those surveillance towers and all the electronics, knocking down the electromagnetic spectrum for the network connectivity for the Israeli army, makes them rely on civilians and the mayor in a bunker to get on their cell phone and phone them and say that they see a missile strike. But that's what we're seeing here, because this was one of the moments that the Israeli military did admit to it. They said 2 members of Metula's local security team were injured by last night's Hezbollah anti-tank guided missile attack, one seriously wounded while the other is listed in good condition. The pair, like all local security officers in border communities, are listed by the IDF as reservists amid the war. And this, again, just demonstrates that Hezbollah is able to find these positions. They move between these buildings, these houses, and Hezbollah is able to find these military positions as they move throughout this village of Metula. This has been wasted in the way that Leslie Stahl told us on CNN, or on 60 Minutes, sorry, CBS. So it's pretty remarkable that Israel allowed that crew to come in. And in the actual 60 Minutes story, I don't think I said it, in the actual 60 Minutes story, Leslie Stahl says that it's humiliating. It's the death of the North, that they've lost the North. Those are the words that she uses, humiliating, which is just the word that's been used to describe Israeli military operations from the late 1990s through to today. Hezbollah humiliating the Israeli military, driving them out of South Lebanon in 2000, defeating them in days in the July 2006 war, which the ground war in 2006 was effectively a large-scale rescue operation, because the IDF's first units that went in, the vaunted IDF units that were going to encircle Bint Jbeil, where the core of Hezbollah fighters are, the Israeli military didn't even get into the village. They got smoked on the outside of the village and then needed to be rescued. They needed to send armored vehicles up to rescue the soldiers that got hammered. And then those armored vehicles got caught in the valleys, in the wadis, coming up the side of the mountain. Got their convoys of armored vehicles got hit. And that was what the July 2006 war was. It was essentially the ground war element was only a couple of weeks, and it was effectively a 2-week rescue operation to save Israeli soldiers that had got trapped behind the lines, failing in their operation to take over Bint Jbeil in 2006. So this army that is more organized in 2006 than it is now. Now they're degraded, their materiel and manpower is degraded by 9 months of war. And they're telling us that they're about to invade Lebanon. If you listen to their military planners and politicians, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. The Israeli military are doing crazy things. They've clearly lost their minds. But an invasion of South Lebanon with David Petraeus wrote in Foreign Affairs that the Israelis have 15,000 active duty combat troops. So they would have to call up all their reserves again, pull them out of the economy again. And Hezbollah has 150,000 fighters that have been waiting for this battle. They're connected on overland, connected with a hinterland to Syria, to Iraq, where fighters from Syria and Iraq could join the war. Nasrallah's speech last week, he said that they're telling people to chill out because they don't actually need all the people that want to fight in the south. That was the same in 2006 as well. The Christians wanted to fight in 2006 in the South Lebanese villages. They wanted to fight with Hezbollah too. And so I'm not so sure, but Hezbollah is reacting to the Israeli saber rattling in pretty remarkable ways. So last week we watched a 9.5-minute video that Nasrallah said was shot over many days, all over Haifa, all over Israel's most sensitive strategic sites. So that was last week. And then this week, let's do number 25 tomorrow. This week, Hezbollah released this video called "To Whom It May Concern." In case of an inclusive war is imposed on Lebanon, the resistance will fight, Nasrallah says, without constraints, without rules, without limits. And then they released this satellite map, which just has geo coordinates. and moves around. It doesn't tell you what any of these places are. It just moves around to all these installations, offshore gas there. You can clearly see that's a port. You can clearly see that's their strategic oil reserve that we saw in the drone. So this video is called "To Whom It May Concern." It's sent by Hezbollah to Israeli military and security and political figures who all know what these sites are. But Hezbollah doesn't say what the sites are on this video. They just move around to each of the spots in the video. And just, it's called "To Whom It May Concern." Just a real A+ psychological operation here against whoever thinks of a war against us will regret it. Nasrallah said it in his speech a month ago, Habibi, you and whose army, right? Who's the army that you're going to invade? Who's the army you're going to battle Hezbollah with? Is it the one that we've been watching for the last 8 months in Gaza? Is it that army? He said it you and whose army, who's coming to help you, because you're going to need more than that. So let me just give you some of the spots here. So it's Haifa and Hadera ports. It's Ben Gurion Airport, pretty obvious. It's the campus, as it's called, the main defense and security compound headquarters, the military command and control headquarters that's in a civilian neighborhood in Tel Aviv. It's the Ashdod port. It's Israel's strategic oil reserves. Those are offshore. What it's showing you there are offshore. Those are the offshore gas platforms. They show the Ashkelon power plant. They show the Dimona nuclear plant. They show several military and intelligence bases. And that's the point. The point is that everybody in Israel, everyone in Israel who's making the decision to go to war or planning the war on Lebanon knows what those sites are, and knows that they're in risks, that those sites are at risk. Hezbollah knows exactly where they are. They have precision-guided rockets and missiles that can cover the entire territory. Like I said, the Israeli military is exhausted and degraded from their battle in Gaza. And so Hezbollah has really turned up the pressure, turned up the psyops from the north over the last few weeks to meet this, to meet the Israeli psyops, which are just terrible, just saying we're coming for you. They show a few tanks driving on the back of trucks up the border, and and then their tweet army says they're coming for you, Nasrallah. It's just a joke, and Hezbollah gives us this real high grade stuff. So that is the battle on the northern border. Again, this week on the Resistance Report, we went from the very south of the Gaza Strip to the very far north border of occupied Palestine in the Galilee, the first area that will be taken over if there's a war. There's no indication that if there's a ground war into Lebanon, I think there's almost as good a chance that the ground war will be inside Israel as it is for Israel to penetrate Bint Jbeil and fight in Bint Jbeil. I think you're more likely to see fighting in Betula. But again, we won't predict these things. We have enough information, enough facts in this moment to not do predictions and not to not predict, but those are the facts surrounding the situation on the northern border for Israel. So that is the Resistance Report for this week.
Incredible. Thank you so much, John. Yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot to ask you about and discuss, but primarily even though Israel knows, and some of its generals and military experts have said that they wouldn't be able to win a war against Hezbollah, it seems like the top government officials are still gunning for it. I mean,
it does.
It's pretty spectacular and very on brand for Israel.
That quote, John, that you said is so striking. They've lost the north.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what an admission.
The map has been redrawn, right?
Right.
Yeah, well, those people who stay, those are like the settlement secretaries, like I quoted from Kibbutz Be'eri, the mayor and the secretary of the kibbutz. These people are the people who are leading the kibbutz. They're talking about their people. They're not talking about a vague, they're talking about their actual people that live next door that they know are not coming home. And they've lost the north in a significant way because there's not even Israeli military presence in there, as we saw in those Metula strikes. The Israeli armored vehicles have moved off the border by and large, almost entirely across the border. They've tried to move at least 10 kilometers back from the border to get out of range of Kornet anti-tank guided missile strikes, and so the buildup for an invasion of Lebanon, I don't think it's something that we're going to just be surprised by, between one show and the next.
Yeah.
I think you're going to see weeks and weeks of buildup to be ready to fight that war, unless they're talking about an air war. And if Israel's talking about an air war, they're having an air war against Hezbollah, who for the last 20 years has been digging tunnels and making concrete bunkers and preparing for an air war. So even an air war that massacres civilians isn't going to destroy Hezbollah. It won't even really destroy Hezbollah positions because those positions are underground and they're not accessible by Israeli airstrikes. So I'm not even sure what the plan is for these guys, but as I said, it's a strategic catastrophe for Israel that will hasten its demise, not put it in a stronger position.
Ali, last week on the live stream, we were broadcasting at the same time that Hassan Nasrallah was delivering a speech, and we weren't really able to to do both at the same time. Did you want to talk a little bit about what he talked about and what struck you as important to point out?
Yeah, well, at this point, I think we've basically covered the main points, which is that he laid out how costly any war would be for Israel. He again was open about the fact that it would be costly for Lebanon, but that it would be very costly for Israel. And I think he's sending a message of deterrence to Israel, but reassuring the home front and reassuring the people in the region that we're capable of this fight. We're not looking for it, but we won't shy away from it if that's what we have to do, and that resistance is the way. I think that's a theme that comes back, that he makes the case that there is no alternative to resistance because surrender doesn't make you safer. And Palestinians know that. Palestinians in the West Bank are not going through the intense genocide that Israel is currently doing in Gaza, but people in the West Bank are not safe. Their land is not safe. In fact, they are arguably more vulnerable to a genocide because the Palestinian Authority has worked hand in hand with Israel to dismantle the resistance as much as they can in the West Bank. So I think that's a theme that he made that was important. John gave us some of the sort of the military aspects of that. Tamara, I want to also just put up the piece by that's a clip of Nasrallah speaking, but this piece by our colleague Maureen Murphy, I think gives a lot of insight into this as well, and I think it's worth reading. So I just want to highlight that piece by Maureen for those who are listening. It's called "Bombing and Starving Gaza Can't Reverse Israel's Strategic Failure." It was published just yesterday as I'm speaking, a very fresh analysis. And then if you scroll down, I mean, Maureen touches on a couple of issues to do with Palestine, particularly the recent UN Commission of Inquiry report that we discussed briefly a week or two ago in the context of the what it says about the mass rapes. Maureen goes into more depth there. But she also, if you go down to the section, Tamara, that covers Hezbollah's strategic failure, she actually go down to the Lebanon section. She discusses this more in the context of Israel's strategic failure in Lebanon. One thing that's important to point out from Nasrallah's speech is that he delivered a warning to Cyprus. He said basically that Hezbollah has discovered that Cyprus has agreed to allow Israel to use its air bases, and that's a recognition by Israel that all its air bases are vulnerable to Hezbollah, that it doesn't have any air bases that it can fully protect, and therefore it might want to use these offshore bases in Cyprus. And what Nasrallah said is basically that if Cyprus or any other country allows Israel to use their territory to attack Lebanon, Hezbollah will deal with them just the same way as it would deal with Israel. And then Cyprus rushed to try to deny that. And just hold it there, Tamara, if you can scroll up a bit back to the Lebanon section. So that's important too, as Cyprus rushed to try and deny that. And then I just wanted to show that link to Breakthrough News, an interview by Rania Khalek of the analyst Elijah Magnia, who also gives a lot of insight, well worth watching, and Maureen teases out some of the threads from that. So there's a lot there that, rather than me give my own views, some of which you've heard, I really recommend, in addition to the analysis you've heard here, checking out Maureen's piece. Again, the headline is "Bombing and Starving Gaza Can't Reverse Israel's Strategic Failure." That's on the front page of the Electronic Intifada today. So that's what I wanted to say about Lebanon.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ali. We have a couple of topics that we want to get into, one of which is any news on the so-called ceasefire front that is relevant or rational.
Not really. I mean, I mentioned this last week. It seems like there was a big push for a few days by the United States. It seems like it was a PR effort by the Biden administration to shift the blame onto Hamas. But look, I think that from the perspective of the Biden administration, they do want to stop the war because they recognize that it is a complete failure for Israel and a huge liability for them. There's no morality in this. They don't want to stop the war out of any concern for Palestinians. Let's not make that mistake. And they're not willing to stop it at any price. I mean, people should be trying to stop a genocide at any price. They don't want to. They're happy for the genocide to continue if their conditions aren't met, which is that, I mean, we talked about this last week. Israel has been defeated militarily. It's lost the war militarily. As we say again and again, we don't count murdering people, carrying out the kind of atrocities we talked about with Laila Al-Arian. That's not fighting. That's not war. That's just crime. That's genocide. When it comes to fighting, Israel has been defeated. It's lost. And there's no coming back from that. Israel's not going to, suddenly turn around and start fighting in the tunnels or come up with new tanks all of a sudden that are going to be safer. So Israel needs to end the war too. But remember what they all said at the beginning. The Israelis, the Biden administration, Blinken, and so on, they all said a ceasefire means Hamas wins. A ceasefire is a Hamas victory. So now if they say ceasefire, we want a ceasefire, in their own terms, they're saying Hamas has won. So what they want is a ceasefire in order to rescue Israel, not to save Palestinian lives, but they want to spin it and market it as a surrender by Hamas. And that they will not get. And so, unfortunately, it means, I think, it's going to continue. And that's the update on that. I don't see much movement there.
And we still have, political operatives like Linda Thomas Greenfield, the U.S.'s representative at the United Nations, in which she said, I think it was either today or yesterday, she said, again, it's Hamas being, obstructionist and not taking Israel's generous offer into consideration. Hamas needs
the
to
so-called
just
Israeli offer that Israel keeps repudiating.
That's right. Very publicly.
Very publicly and repeatedly. And Netanyahu did it again. No ceasefire, no end to the war. He said that, a partial deal to get the captives out. He doesn't even want all of them. And then we go back to the war. Right. And so that's why, tying it back to Lebanon, any rational analysis says it would be absolutely suicidal for Israel to launch a war on Lebanon. But Israeli leaders are not rational. And that's why we really can't count on that. If they were rational, they wouldn't have done everything they're doing in Gaza. I'm not even talking about moral. I'm just saying rational from their own perspective. They have lost, of course, Palestinians have lost far more, but Israel has suffered real losses, military, economic, political, international diplomatic losses, and those losses are increasing. On the legal front, their leaders are now, for the first time in history, facing international indictments. Those are all losses, and they will continue to rack up. So from a rational perspective, they would stop. They would change policy. They won't. So that's why we can't count on them not doing something very stupid in Lebanon. And that may even be their only way out, in a sense, from their perspective. Escalate the war, force the Americans to intervene directly, as they will likely do, at least with air power, join in the bombing of Lebanon or who knows what absolute horrors. So that's the reality there.
Yeah, I'm reminded of back in sort of the end of October, November, before the ground invasion of the Gaza Strip started in earnest, and we were having a similar sort of discussion about how it wouldn't be rational from the point of view of Israel's own interest for them to invade Gaza on the ground, but that we couldn't discount it, and that, it was a very real danger, as proved to be correct, because the Israelis are not acting rationally. They're acting out of pure violence and the sort of self-destructive logic of settler colonialism. And so, that may well prove to be the case here again, but I think a lot has obviously changed since then. As you said, there's been real material losses for the Israelis, as Jon has been diligently documenting all these weeks and months.
Yeah, there's not even a self-preservation instinct in Zionism right now. We're not seeing that, because this opening the front on Lebanon means that you just are, and the ceasefire charade just means you're letting your people die. The people that were in the envelope, that you're relying on people to go back to Metula and Kibbutz Be'eri and to be frontier towns that are the front line, where you have human shields on the front lines. And so it's just, even from an Israeli perspective, to go to war, you're just abandoning your own people, to die in Gaza. Even just the Zionists themselves should be pointing out that it's not rational, that this is the trajectory that begins the end of your state. When you're genocidal, when you're being chased all around the world by international criminal courts, and then you're threatening Hezbollah with a degraded military that's exhausted after 9 months and is not going to fare well in Lebanon, where they have to, in Gaza, they drive along a sandy beach. That's how they invaded Gaza. They drove along the beach. To get to Lebanon, you got to drive up a hill. It's a very, very different, goes back to Sun Tzu, don't fight uphill. It's one of the principles of warfare. And it's the defining principle of Israel entering Lebanon is to fight through these areas that they have no history of successfully operating in, even during their occupation, which is why they had the South Lebanon Army carry out their occupation. Because
and if you've been to South Lebanon, you know that the landscape is completely different from Gaza and completely different from much of Palestine. What's striking in South Lebanon is that it is extremely mountainous. Very mountainous. In fact, Nasrallah mentioned in his speech that part of the reason the Israelis went to Cyprus is because there is mountainous landscape in Cyprus that is similar to South Lebanon. And so the Israelis were going there to try to train to take on Hezbollah. But presumably, the mountains of Cyprus do not have, cities buried deep under them, which we can assume is the case in Lebanon, and so that's not going to help them very much. But
with 100,000 fighters who have 7 years of house-to-house combat experience fighting in Syria, who defeated the Israelis in much better shape in 2006, it's a strategic disaster for Israel. And I think Nasrallah is giving those speeches from a position of confidence, but also just a position of respect, a respect for Lebanon. He's not offering up Lebanon to be destroyed. He's being careful. He's being careful with the lives of his people and people of Lebanon, and not full on drawing the Israelis into this war, because that's what a disciplined leadership, military leadership, political leadership does. It's the exact opposite of how the Israelis behave.
Yeah.
Let's also talk a little bit about there are these two top headlines in the mainstream news today. Miriam Adelson.
Let's start with Miriam Adelson. I just want to point out this. Tamara will put that up.
So vile.
This story in the New York Times from yesterday, from Tuesday. The pro-Israel donor with a $100 million plan to elect Trump, and they're talking about Miriam Adelson, the multi-tens of billion dollar, worth $30 billion widow of Sheldon Adelson, who was the biggest donor to Trump's campaign in 2016 and 2020. And they're both...
And helped fund all these just absolutely vicious and vile Israel-aligned organizations in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. And by all accounts, Miriam Adelson, who now controls her late husband's financial empire, is even more fanatically pro-Israel than even her husband was. And it says, the New York Times says, she is poised to become one of the biggest donors in the presidential election, and if Mr. Trump wins, one of the most powerful private citizens with a say in American foreign policy. Fiercely hawkish on Israel, she was deeply unnerved by the Hamas attacks on October 7th and would be likely to shape a second Trump administration's posture on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Dr. Adelson, this is Miriam Adelson, 78, has never been a shrinking violet, but she long operated in the shadow of her husband, Sheldon Adelson, who died in January 2021. Then there's a quote from David Friedman, who was Trump's fanatical pro-Israel ambassador to Tel Aviv. And they also say, this is interesting, some interesting color here. They say that unlike the Boston-reared Mr. Adelson, Miriam Adelson was born in Israel and speaks fluent Hebrew, her English marked by a heavy Israeli accent. A former officer in the Israel Defense Forces, she spends most of her time these days not in their longtime home, Las Vegas, but in Israel, where she holds dual citizenship. And what's remarkable to me is the tone of this article in the New York Times is almost like, oh, how cute, how interesting.
What a quirky old lady.
Yeah,
right?
what a quirky old lady. And you can just imagine what their tone would be if, all things being equal, she was the Russian-born, widow of a pro-Russian billionaire and was planning to spend $100 million to influence the election in order to get, pro-Russian policies. But, they present this as look how interesting. Look at this colorful story. Now, it was reported in Haaretz a few weeks ago that what Miriam Adelson wants from Trump is that he approves Israel's annexation of the West Bank. In this story, a spokesperson for Miriam Adelson denies that and says, she hasn't asked for that. But there's good reason to believe. Well, I mean, those are her politics, whether she's making it an explicit quid pro quo or not. That's certainly the direction she will push. That's certainly the direction David Friedman, the Trump advisor and ambassador to Israel, also pushed. So that's that. And then we can see, and what's interesting in this story is it says, well, she hasn't started giving Trump the money yet. She's going to, but they say here that, she's not going to give the money until Nikki Haley officially drops out of the Republican race, because Nikki Haley, who was Trump's UN ambassador and, the one writing "Finish Them" on Israeli artillery shells, is, until she bows out of the race, she's not going to give it. But it could be that she, that's just an excuse, that she's really making Trump dance for the money. And by all accounts, he is doing so. So let's look at that Jerusalem Post story, Tamara, which we can see the headline, Trump urges his followers to watch October 7 film. And what's the film he's talking about? It's definitely not Laila Al-Arian's The Night Won't End that we just talked about, but it is the Sheryl Sandberg hoax film, Pushing the Mass Rape Lies. So, which we've, of course, debunked and discussed extensively. So look who's promoting that genocidal atrocity propaganda against Palestinians. Hillary Clinton was out of the door with that. Last week, we talked about how the White House held a screening of this film with Kamala Harris headlining it. And now Donald Trump is urging people to watch this fraudulent film full of lies about mass rapes, where there's no evidence for them whatsoever. And it just shows how united, how bipartisanship is extremely strong in the United States when it comes to supporting genocide of the Palestinians. And I don't know if people want to say more about that, or if we should just go on to the next one.
Just quickly, it's very interesting about Miriam Adelson. Like, people should underestimate her at their own peril. I mean, I wrote a story about this story, thanks to Tamara, about Miriam Adelson when her late husband Sheldon died in 2021, titled Miriam Adelson Now Leads Sheldon's Pro-Israel Empire. And I detailed some of the things that we know about her, we knew about her at the time. At one stage, she was quite in favor of Nikki Haley in the Republican primaries. One little detail that stood out to me at the time, if you remember, of course, if our viewers and listeners remember, the story of Jonathan Pollard, the Israeli spy who, in return for money, large amounts of money, spied on the United States for Israel. When he was freed back in the end of 2020, I believe it was, or either the end of 2020 or early 2021, his private jet flew him straight to Israel, was of course funded by Sheldon and Miriam Adelson. So, their fingers are in a lot of pro-Israel pies.
They were the driving force and the financial force behind Trump's moving the embassy to Jerusalem. It was a very obvious quid pro quo, and they're poised to do the same whether or not Trump is elected or Biden is reelected.
Yeah,
I mean,
they'll be behind.
It's very bipartisan. Exactly. Quickly, did we want to say something about Jamal Bowman?
Yes, I think we should. Let's put up that NBC report, Tamara, which is very typical of how this is being covered. Representative Jamal Bowman, a Democrat, member of the so-called Squad, the progressive group of members of Congress from New York. And as the NBC puts it, a vocal Israel critic and Squad member loses primary. This is a big story because he lost his primary election last night, so he will be leaving Congress. And it's a big story because AIPAC, the Israel lobby group, spent something like $16 million trying to defeat him and clearly was successful, although there are other factors involved. His district was redrawn and he lost some of his base of support. But that's the way it's being spun. But I think there's another aspect to this or lesson from it, which is that there really was a loss of enthusiasm for him among many real progressive people because he was constantly trying to pander to the Israel lobby while posing as being supportive of Palestine. I'll give you some examples. Recently, for example, Bowman, we can put up that item from Politico, Tamara. Bowman actually at first said that there was no evidence for the mass rapes on October 7th. And then after he came under attack from the pro-genocide Israel lobby, he reversed his position, a very wishy-washy, cowardly thing to do. And he then claimed, quote, that the UN confirmed that Hamas committed rape and sexual violence. And then going back to his election, or when he entered Congress, I think was in 2020, and I covered this back in 2021. If we put up the piece I wrote, Tamara, we can see that he was pandering. He opposed BDS. He voted for funding for Iron Dome and other weapons for Israel. In fact, the group Within Our Lifetime, a Palestinian American group that has been pressing to hold Bowman and others accountable, listed some of the things he's done. So this is reading from their list. He refused to sponsor a resolution recognizing the Nakba. He voted yes on House Resolution 888, equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Yes on HR 5917, sanctioning the Palestinian resistance. Yes on HR 966, which endorsed debunked Zionist propaganda about sexual violence. Yes on HR 6679, anti-Palestinian immigration bill, and others. He voted for military aid to Israel. So there was just no enthusiasm for him. And I think the lesson here is that, once again, a lesson that people refuse to learn is that pandering and appeasement never work with the Israel lobby. They will not accept anything except complete and total surrender. And then when you've done that, they'll demand more. And this effort to try to triangulate by giving wishy-washy, watered down support to Palestinians while pandering to the Israel lobby and giving them the weapons to murder Palestinians, literally, does nothing for Palestinians. Palestinians at all, and ends up not appeasing the Israel lobby either. All it does is drive the debate to the right, give them concessions, and open the door for the people who AIPAC will really support, who will do all their bidding. And you can see some of the commentary. For example, there's an excellent piece by Margaret Kimberley in Black Agenda Report, which is a really excellent publication, and she's quite scathing as always with her headline, Jamal Bowman, AIPAC, phony progressives and black misleadership. And she says that just her conclusion is very sharp. AIPAC doesn't respect the two-faced double talkers. You are either with them or against them. Bowman even made an obligatory trip to Israel in 2021. He shouldn't have bothered. No one respects half-stepping phonies. Black Agenda Report certainly does not, and we uphold the tradition of exposing the scoundrels while working to help create politics which puts people's interests at the forefront. So that is a very sharp, but I think a very fair analysis, sadly. And then finally, just a comment from Raja Abdul Haq, who is in New York. He's a Muslim Palestinian activist and community organizer and a co-founder of 𝐓𝐡𝐞 News, the Palestinian online news network that we often quote in our reporting. And he says in one of his tweets, in the case of Palestine, while Bowman presented himself as anti-AIPAC, he was very pro-Israel. He defended Israel's right to defend itself, supported Iron Dome funding, equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and accused pro-Palestine protesters of being anti-Semitic. So again, you can see how people are reacting to this. And I think the lessons do need to be taken, but I doubt that they people will keep trying to tell us, oh, this is a lesser evil. And some people have been saying in discussions I've been having online, they've been saying, oh, well, it's not that Bowman was great. It's that we should be opposed to AIPAC for taking out, we should be worried that AIPAC has this power to unseat, any member of Congress they don't like. Yeah, that is terrible. But don't ask me when we're struggling to do all the things we need to do to prioritize saving Bowman, to make a point about AIPAC over stopping genocide. The only goal should be stopping the genocide, not saving, fake progressives who are really not doing anything for us. So I know people's views on that differ, but we were told by even some people in our community, oh, Joe Biden is the lesser evil. Joe Biden brought us a Holocaust. The Holocaust of our time. Yeah, that's what lesser evilism brings. So, people say, well, what should we do? I mean, I don't give advice on voting. It's not what I want to do or where I want to go. But what I want to say is that maybe the answer isn't there. Maybe we can't vote our way out of genocide, especially not by voting for the party that brought us genocide. So maybe different strategies are what we need to be talking about.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what you're saying there, Ali, resonates with the UK. Like, we've got the election in the UK a week tomorrow. Maybe we'll say more about that next week in the discussion next week, which will be the day before the election. But yeah, exactly the same dynamics going on here with fake progressives.
It's everywhere. Okay, just a couple minutes left. Maybe we can just say a brief thing about Julian Assange. He is now a free man. It was kind of hard to believe looking at him walking out this morning and finally being able to hug his wife and family. A very welcome bit of good news.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's not ideal that he had to accept a plea deal.
No,
but, I mean, absolutely, I would have taken the same deal, to be honest
absolutely.
with you. But it's still, there's still very big problems with this, because in the sense that the UK, well, the US and its lapdog, the United States, its minor client state, the UK, they're trying to sort of portray this. They will try to set this as a kind of precedent, I suppose, against press freedom. But still, I mean, overall, I would say it's a net win for press freedom that Julian Assange is out for, doing
and a huge indictment again of this system and our so-called democracy that tortures journalists and whistleblowers in prisons for so long.
He was in prison for 5 years for doing journalism, and he was in one of the UK's worst prisons. This was a prison where they put alleged Al-Qaeda members.
Right.
You know, it's kind of like the UK's, not quite the UK's Guantanamo, but similar.
Just amazing. Well, we'll continue to. Yeah, Ali, did
It's
you?
great that I'm so happy for him and his family. I'm sorry that his case exposed the sham of so-called Western democracy and free speech, and how really they are when the gloves come off, they're the worst in the world. And I'm sorry that he had to suffer for that to be exposed, but that's where it is. I don't know if I should say, I already said it on Twitter. I forgot to mention this, but I was banned by Germany. Can I just,
right.
Speaking of press freedom, I forgot to mention it, but I had, people remember that back in April, the Palestine conference in Berlin, where I was supposed to speak, Dr. Hassan Abu-Sittah was supposed to speak, and others, was brutally attacked and shut down by the German police. And Dr. Hassan Abu-Sittah was banned from Germany, banned from most of Europe. There was a ban on his political activities. Same with Yanis Varoufakis, a Greek politician, member of the or I don't know if he's a member of the European Parliament. I think he was a candidate. I'm not sure now. But I did work with the same lawyer who got the Schengen ban for Dr. Salman Abu-Sittah overturned. And we put in an inquiry to the German government, and I was politically banned by Germany for the month of April, not allowed to speak there, not even allowed to address Germans by telephone or Zoom or via the internet. We're still waiting for the inquiries to come back as to whether there was also a travel ban. The Germans had prepared a long letter to hand to me if I'd gotten into the country, listing all my thought crimes, including criticizing the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, supporting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Apparently, I disseminate Russian propaganda about Ukraine. That's also in the list of thought crimes. And speaking about the Palestinian armed resistance. So if you're listening, Germany, boycott Israel, and support, and Palestinians have a right to armed resistance against the genocide that you, Germany, are supporting. So just want to make that clear. When we find out about the travel ban, I'll let you know, and maybe we'll do a fuller coverage. But just in the context of press freedom in the West, I thought that had to be briefly mentioned.
Incredible. Well, we are out of time. We already highlighted some of our stories from this week on the Electronic Intifada, but maybe we can just put up the homepage for a minute. And Asa, if you want to put up some of the comments, go to the Electronic Intifada. Our homepage is full of brand new features by our courageous, phenomenal writers in Gaza. There are just, it feels like we're publishing.
You know what Laila Al-Arian said? What Laila Al-Arian said about working with Mu'tasim Dalloul, the journalist, who was apologetic to her for not getting back to her when he was dealing with the murder of his wife and son. This applies, I don't have the words to say it, but all our writers in Gaza, all our contributors are going through similar things, and they are continuing to show up and to report. So please support them by reading, by sharing, I get these incredible messages from people who say, I print out the articles and I hand them out at the weekly protest in our town or wherever it might be. Share them with friends and family. Get the word out, because people are working under unbelievable conditions, documenting the absolute horror that they're going through, and they're all on the front page. The piece on the front there by Malak Hijazi, Gaza, Where Have You Gone, is just heartbreaking. It's just amazing stuff.
Yeah. electronicintifada.net. Sign up for our email list right there at the top left of the website, and also go to our YouTube page, sign up, subscribe to get notified of our latest episodes. And with that, thank you all very much. Tamara, of course, behind the scenes, everyone at the Electronic Intifada. Thank you, and we'll see you very soon.